The luxurious hum of the airplane engines filled the air as passengers settled into their first-class seats, preparing for a smooth flight across the country. The air was thick with the soft chatter of well-heeled professionals and vacationers, all eagerly anticipating their destination. But no one knew that this flight would be anything but ordinary. Keanu Reeves, one of Hollywood's most beloved actors, sat in a plush leather seat near the window, his signature calm demeanor seemingly untouched by the world around him. His brown eyes scanned the horizon, lost in thought, the faintest hint of a smile on his lips. He had become a household name, not only for his acting but for the way he carried himself, humble, gracious, and always kind to those around him. To most of the people on this flight, he was the last person they expected to see involved in any kind of drama. But what happened next would change everything. The flight attendants had just begun their routine checks when suddenly, chaos erupted. The quiet hum of the airplane was shattered by a loud, frantic voice over the intercom. "Everyone, stay in your seats. Stay in your seats," the voice shouted, breathless and panicked. It was Nathan, the pilot. For a split second, the passengers froze, unsure whether it was some kind of malfunction or a bizarre, unsettling joke. But as the voice continued, it became clear that something was terribly wrong. I need assistance. I need assistance now." Nathan's voice cracked as if he were in the midst of a panic attack, followed by a loud crash. And then silence. A cold chill swept through the cabin. Passengers exchanged nervous glances, murmuring to one another. What could possibly be happening? What had just occurred? Keanu, who had been seated quietly by the window, stood up. The air around him seemed to thicken as he slowly made his way toward the front of the plane, his calm presence oddly reassuring to those nearby. As he walked toward the cockpit, he could hear the frantic voice of the pilot coming from the small intercom speaker, his words increasingly erratic. The flight attendants rushed down the aisles, their faces ashen. One of them, a young woman named Sarah, grabbed Keanu's arm, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Mr. Reeves, you should stay seated," she said, her eyes wide with fear. "Something's happening. We need to—" Before she could finish, there was a loud crash from the cockpit. Keanu's heart raced. Without thinking, he gently removed Sarah's hand from his arm and continued his journey toward the front of the plane. He reached the cockpit door and knocked once, his voice steady. "Nathan? It's Keanu. What's going on?" There was no response. A sense of urgency settled over him. Keanu knew this wasn't just another in-flight emergency. He could feel it in his gut. He knocked again, harder this time. Still, no answer. Panic began to set in among the flight attendants and passengers, but Keanu's calm demeanor remained unshaken. He didn't hesitate. He pushed the door open. Inside the cockpit, Nathan stood in front of the control panel, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the controls. His face was pale, eyes wide with fear and confusion. "Nathan," Keanu said, his voice soft but firm. "What's going on? What's happened?" Nathan turned toward him slowly, his expression unreadable, almost as if he hadn't recognized who Keanu was for a moment. The disoriented look on his face morphed into something darker, something unsettling. Before Keanu could react, Nathan's arm shot out, and with a speed Keanu didn't expect, he shoved him backward, sending him stumbling into the cockpit wall. The blow wasn't hard enough to knock Keanu down, but it was enough to make his heart skip a beat. What the hell was happening? Why was Nathan attacking him? The air was thick with tension as Keanu regained his footing, his mind racing. "Nathan!" Keanu called out, voice laced with confusion. "What are you doing? You need to calm down. We're in the air, and people need you to stay focused." But Nathan's eyes weren't on Keanu anymore. He was looking at something, someone, behind him. Keanu's confusion deepened. A cold sense of dread crept into his chest. In that instant, Nathan lunged forward again, this time with a force that left no room for doubt. The pilot's hands gripped Keanu's shirt, his fingers tight and desperate, his breath ragged. There was no mistaking the terror in Nathan's eyes as he stared at Keanu, his words barely a whisper. "You don't understand. They're coming for me. They've been watching. It's all gone wrong." Keanu tried to break free, But Nathan's grip was unyielding. Something was horribly wrong. The air around him seemed to grow heavier, suffocating. He could feel his pulse quicken, the danger escalating by the second. It wasn't just the physical threat that alarmed him. It was the crazed fear in Nathan's voice that sent chills down his spine. Before Keanu could react further, the door to the cockpit opened wide, and a flight attendant burst in, along with two other passengers who had overheard the commotion. They rushed to separate Nathan from Keanu, trying to hold him back. In the chaos, Keanu caught sight of a strange, terrified look in Nathan's eyes as he glanced past the group and down at the floor. The words Nathan had whispered before rang in Keanu's mind like an echo. "They're coming for me." The flight attendant who had entered the cockpit looked at Keanu, her face pale with fear. "We need to get him under control," she said. "He's lost it." Keanu nodded, trying to suppress the panic rising within him. This was no ordinary disturbance. It was something more, something bigger. Nathan was no longer the confident, professional pilot Keanu had briefly encountered earlier. He was a man unraveling, spiraling into madness, his grip on reality slipping. But Keanu couldn't just sit back and watch. He had to find out what was going on. What had pushed Nathan to this breaking point? As the attendants and passengers finally restrained the pilot, Keanu looked around the small, confined space of the cockpit, his mind racing with 1,000 questions. The plane was still airborne, still heading toward its destination, but Keanu knew, deep down, that everything had just changed. And whatever happened next, no one would ever forget. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? As the passengers were gradually reassured by the flight attendants and the remaining calm from Keanu, the plane continued its path through the skies. But in the hushed moments between the frantic whispers and murmured confusion, Keanu found himself reflecting on everything that had led to this moment. He couldn't help but feel that something more was at play here, something beyond just a moment of personal breakdown. Keanu sat back in his seat after the flight attendants reassured everyone that Nathan had been restrained and was being monitored in a secure section of the plane. The hum of the airplane's engines and the low chatter of passengers trying to calm themselves was still present, but the unease in the air was palpable. Keanu ran a hand through his hair, feeling the tension that had yet to fully release from his body. Keanu Reeves had always been an enigma to the public. The actor famous for his roles in The Matrix and John Wick was adored not only for his compelling performances but also for his incredibly down-to-earth nature. He never let fame go to his head, and his reputation for kindness and humility was a constant theme in interviews and stories from those who had worked with him. But those who were closest to him knew the quiet pain that lingered behind his serene smile. Keanu's past had been a series of losses, each one pulling at his heartstrings in a way that never seemed to heal fully. The death of his stillborn daughter, the tragic car accident that claimed the life of his best friend, River Phoenix, and the breakdown of his long-term relationship with Jennifer Syme. All these events had shaped Keanu's life, his career, and the way he viewed the world. Despite it all, Keanu continued to be a symbol of resilience. He didn't seek comfort or recognition from the public eye. He kept his personal life private, living with a quiet strength that many admired but few truly understood. On this flight, though, as he sat quietly in his seat, he couldn't help but feel that, despite all the pain he had weathered in life, the strange events unfolding in this very moment were somehow different. The fact that the situation seemed to involve Nathan, the pilot, someone who had likely dealt with similar kinds of stress and inner turmoil, made Keanu wonder how far the cracks in the world around them could go. As the flight continued its course through the air, Keanu's thoughts drifted to Nathan, the man who had attacked him without explanation. Keanu had known something wasn't right the moment he entered the cockpit. There had been a subtle tremor in Nathan's voice, something hidden behind his professional facade that spoke of years of buried stress and a brewing storm. Nathan wasn't always like this. He was once a rising star in the aviation world. As a young man, he had dreamed of flying high above the clouds. He had spent years working hard to achieve the position he now held, eventually becoming a seasoned pilot with years of experience under his belt. Nathan had even married young. His wife, Angela, being the love of his life and his anchor. They had 2 young children, a son and a daughter, and his family meant everything to him. But somewhere along the way, Nathan had lost his balance. It started with small things, little mistakes that never seemed significant enough to warrant concern. A slight delay in paperwork, a missed maintenance check, a few too many long hours at the airport. The kind of pressure that slowly starts to wear you down. For most, these were just part of the job, but for Nathan, the anxiety began to eat away at him. As the stress piled on, Nathan found himself withdrawing from his family. Angela grew concerned but didn't know how to reach him. She noticed the late nights, the distant expressions, and the tension that seemed to follow him everywhere. Their conversations became strained, and the emotional distance between them grew wider with each passing day. The more Nathan tried to focus on his career, the more his personal life fell apart. Eventually, Angela left him, taking the children with her. Nathan was left alone, his heart shattered, his mind lost in the chaos of it all. Still, Nathan kept flying. He buried himself in work, unable to confront the emotional wreckage in his personal life. His thoughts became consumed with self-doubt, the fear that he was failing not only as a father and husband but as a man. The pressures of being a pilot grew even heavier, especially after a near-miss accident caused by his own moment of distraction during a flight. The company, while giving him a second chance, had also placed him under intense scrutiny, further intensifying the internal turmoil he felt. But what truly pushed Nathan over the edge wasn't just the pressure of his job or his failing marriage. It was something deeper. He began hearing voices, strange, disembodied whispers that he couldn't explain. At first, he thought it was just the stress. After all, who wouldn't crack under the pressure of a high-stakes career? But then, the voices grew louder, more persistent. They told him things, strange things. They warned him of an impending disaster, of a time when he would no longer be in control of his own fate. The voices became clearer, and Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching him. He tried to push the voices aside, but they grew louder the more he ignored them. The warning signs were there, but Nathan couldn't discern whether they were a product of his unraveling mind or something more sinister. And now, standing in the cockpit of the airplane, surrounded by the cool metal walls of the plane he had flown for years, Nathan had no idea what to do. His world was spinning out of control, and the weight of it all was too much to bear. As Keanu sat and reflected, he couldn't help but wonder if Nathan's outburst on the plane had been the result of something much deeper than a simple breakdown. What if the voices Nathan had been hearing, the whispers that tormented him, had driven him to the edge? It was becoming increasingly clear to Keanu that the man in the cockpit wasn't just some random pilot who had lost control. There was more to Nathan's story, a dark undercurrent that was just beginning to surface. And Keanu, despite the unexpected and dangerous circumstances he had found himself in, couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that somehow, the truth behind Nathan's meltdown was going to be tied to something much bigger than a flight gone wrong. As Keanu's thoughts swirled, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let Nathan suffer alone. But how could he help? The plane was still airborne, and the passengers were still on edge. The mystery of what had driven Nathan to this point was only beginning to unfold. And Keanu, for the first time in a long while, felt as though he was standing at the precipice of something that would change his life forever. The flight was far from ordinary now. With Nathan restrained and the flight attendants doing their best to keep the passengers calm, the plane continued its journey through the skies. But beneath the surface of polite conversations and murmured reassurances, an undeniable tension simmered among the passengers. Something was off, something much bigger than a simple medical emergency. Keanu could feel it, a lingering presence of unease that threatened to unravel at any moment. As the plane hummed steadily on its course, Keanu leaned back in his seat, his mind still racing. What had caused Nathan to snap like that? The once calm, professional pilot had turned into a man desperate for escape, lashing out at him with an intensity Keanu hadn't expected. It was as though Nathan had completely lost touch with reality. Keanu had been in high-pressure situations before. His career in Hollywood, with its endless deadlines and public scrutiny, had taught him how to manage stress. But this was different. There was something raw, something deeply unsettling about what had transpired in the cockpit. He couldn't shake the feeling that the pilot's breakdown wasn't just the result of a bad day or an isolated mental health crisis. It felt as if something darker was lurking beneath the surface. He glanced toward the front of the cabin, where a few flight attendants were gathered, speaking in hushed tones. One of them, Sarah, who had been closest to him during the initial chaos, caught his eye. Her face was pale, and she didn't look like someone who had just gone through an emergency situation. She looked like someone who was still in shock, struggling to process what had happened. Keanu stood up, deciding that it was time to get some answers. As he walked toward the front of the plane, he tried to shake the eerie sense that everything had somehow gone wrong. He had learned enough over the years to know that in situations like these, nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. When he reached Sarah, she looked up at him, her expression guarded. "Mr. Reeves," she said quietly, "we've got the situation under control. But I'm not sure what just happened back there. It wasn't just a simple breakdown." Sarah looked thoughtful for a moment, then gave a slight nod. "There's Dr. Miller, a psychiatrist. She's sitting in 2B. She's been traveling with us for a while, and I've overheard her talking about things like stress disorders and psychotic episodes in the past. Maybe she could help." Keanu made his way down the aisle toward Dr. Miller's seat, his mind still processing everything Sarah had said. The thought that Nathan's breakdown might be linked to something larger, something more sinister, kept nagging at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were all caught in the middle of something bigger than just an ordinary crisis. When Keanu reached Dr. Miller's seat, she was reading a medical journal, her glasses perched on the edge of her nose. She looked up as he approached, her calm demeanor making her seem almost out of place given the chaos that had just unfolded. "Dr. Miller?" Keanu said softly, his voice a mix of concern and curiosity. "I need your help. We've got a serious situation on our hands." Dr. Miller put down the journal and looked at him with a steady gaze. "I've heard. The pilot, Nathan? Yes. He's not just having a breakdown. Something's wrong. I don't know if it's psychological or if he's dealing with something more, but I need your expertise." Dr. Miller folded her hands, her expression thoughtful. "I see. I don't know much about Nathan's personal history, but based on what I've heard and what you're telling me, it sounds like he's experiencing some kind of psychosis. It could be triggered by stress or exhaustion, but there might also be deeper, more unresolved issues at play." Keanu's mind raced as Dr. Miller spoke, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. "So, you think this isn't just about his job? That there's something else going on?" "It's hard to say," Dr. Miller replied. "But sometimes, when people experience extreme trauma or pressure, they start to hallucinate or lose touch with reality. And when you throw in the stress of a demanding job, plus personal issues, it can become a ticking time bomb." Keanu took a deep breath, trying to absorb the weight of her words. He knew that Nathan's situation wasn't just about a career gone wrong. There were darker forces at play, and Keanu had a feeling they were just beginning to uncover the surface of it all. Keanu nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "I know. Nathan. He was talking about someone coming for him. And those whispers, he was hearing something that wasn't just in his head. What's going on?" Sarah hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if to make sure no one else was listening. "I don't know everything, but Nathan's been under a lot of pressure. He's been acting strange lately, distant, like he's constantly on edge. It's been going on for weeks, maybe months. But this was something else." Keanu felt a chill run down his spine. The more Sarah spoke, the clearer it became that Nathan's outburst was just the tip of the iceberg. There was something far more complicated going on here, something that was going to take more than just a conversation to fix. "I think Nathan's in more trouble than we realize," Sarah continued, lowering her voice further. "He's been talking to himself, muttering about the Watchers and the end, stuff that doesn't make any sense. He's been off, and we were all hoping it would pass, but now," Keanu frowned. "You think someone was after him?" "I don't know," Sarah said, shaking her head. "But whatever's going on, it's not just a mental breakdown. Something, or someone, has been pushing him. and I don't know if he can hold it together much longer. Keanu's mind raced. This wasn't just about a malfunctioning pilot or a simple case of stress. There was something else at play here, something that had been building for a long time. And the fact that Nathan had mentioned the Watchers only deepened the mystery. What's the plan now? Keanu asked, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. We've got to make sure Nathan stays secure and that the plane keeps on course. We're still several hours from our destination, and we can't afford another distraction, Sarah said, her face set with determination. We'll keep him in the back and monitor him. But if he keeps talking like that, if he keeps acting like he's seeing things, we'll have to land as soon as we can. Keanu nodded, then hesitated for a moment before speaking again. Is there anyone on board who might know more about what's going on with him? Someone who might understand what he's dealing with? And as the plane continued to soar through the clouds, Keanu knew that whatever happened next would challenge everything he thought he knew about the world, about people, and about himself. The soft hum of the airplane engines was the only sound that filled the cabin as Keanu returned to his seat, his mind swirling with a million questions. Dr. Miller's assessment of Nathan's condition had added another layer of complexity to an already tangled situation. Hallucinations? Psychosis? Was Nathan simply losing control of his mind, or was there something else going on? Something that neither Dr. Miller nor the flight attendants had accounted for? Keanu's eyes moved over the faces of the other passengers, their features drawn with concern. Some were staring out of the windows, lost in their own thoughts, while others murmured softly among themselves, unable to shake off the fear that had settled over the flight. The tension was palpable, and it seemed as though every person on board could feel that the journey had taken a dark turn. But amidst the growing sense of uncertainty, Keanu couldn't ignore the sense of urgency that was rising within him. He had been through enough in his life to know that sometimes, when everything felt like it was spiraling out of control, there was one thing you could do: seek the truth. And right now, the truth was about Nathan. Keanu leaned back in his seat, staring out the window, trying to think through the puzzle pieces. Something about Nathan's behavior, the frantic whispers about the Watchers, kept gnawing at him. It wasn't just a mental breakdown, and it wasn't just stress. There was something else at play here. But what? He had to get to the bottom of it, and he had to do it quickly. If Nathan wasn't just suffering from a psychological breakdown, there was no telling how far things could go. The flight was still hours from its destination, and with the pilot out of commission, the fate of everyone on board rested in the hands of the remaining crew. His thoughts were interrupted when Sarah, the flight attendant, came down the aisle toward him. Her face was drawn, but she didn't hesitate to approach Keanu. "Mr. Reeves," she said in a low voice, leaning closer, "there's something you need to see. It's not much, but it's a start." Keanu stood up immediately, his pulse quickening. He followed Sarah to a small, isolated area toward the back of the cabin, where they wouldn't be overheard. She led him to a row of seats near the emergency exit, where a small, worn envelope sat on the floor. The envelope had clearly been crumpled and then carefully smoothed out. The edges were frayed, as though it had been passed around or handled repeatedly. "What is this?" Keanu asked, his curiosity piqued. "I found it near Nathan's seat when I was cleaning up after the altercation," Sarah explained. "It wasn't in plain view, but I noticed it when I passed by. I thought it might be important, so I kept it." Keanu knelt down and picked up the envelope, feeling the weight of the situation settling around him. He could sense that whatever was inside was more than just a letter. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper, yellowed with age and scribbled over in messy handwriting. Keanu's eyes scanned the words, the urgency in the writing almost palpable. "They know. I've seen them. They've been watching me for years. The whispers never stop. I don't know how much longer I can keep this under control. They will come for me, and they will take everything. I can't stop it. I can't make them go away." Keanu's heart skipped a beat. The words were chilling, the frantic nature of the writing impossible to ignore. It was as if Nathan had written this in the midst of a deep panic, his thoughts spiraling out of control. But what was he referring to? Who was Nathan talking about? This doesn't make sense," Keanu murmured, his voice barely a whisper. Is this from Nathan?" Sarah nodded grimly. I think so. It's the only thing I could find near his seat. I don't know if he dropped it, or if someone else placed it there. But I don't know how long it's been in his possession. It might explain some of what he's been saying. Keanu carefully folded the paper back up and slipped it into his pocket, his mind racing. The mention of they and the Watchers felt like an ominous warning, something far beyond the ordinary paranoia of someone on the edge of a mental collapse. Whoever, or whatever, Nathan had been afraid of, it wasn't just a figment of his imagination. The whispers, the cryptic message, and the attack on him in the cockpit, all of it pointed to something much darker, something that was now slowly coming into focus. Keanu had a sinking feeling that they were all in far more danger than they realized. Suddenly, an announcement crackled over the intercom, breaking the uneasy silence that had fallen over the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your flight attendant speaking. We've encountered some technical difficulties. Please remain calm, and we'll keep you updated on the situation. Your safety is our priority. The words technical difficulties were barely out before the plane jerked slightly, as though something had shifted in midair. The unease in the cabin deepened instantly. Passengers gasped, some clutching the armrests, while others exchanged worried glances. The turbulence, although minor, was unsettling. Keanu's heart raced. The cryptic letter, Nathan's strange behavior, and now this. What was happening? And more importantly, was the plane truly in danger, or was this some twisted part of Nathan's breakdown? He looked around the cabin, his instincts on high alert. The flight attendants were doing their best to keep things under control, but Keanu could see the fear in their eyes. They didn't know what was going on either, and it was clear that no one on board was prepared for what was coming next. Keanu's thoughts were interrupted as Sarah leaned in closer, her voice a whisper. There's something else you should know. We've been getting strange reports from the cockpit. It's like Nathan's been hearing voices. He's been talking about them. The Watchers, like they're real. And her voice faltered, and Keanu could see the fear in her eyes. And what? He pressed urgently. Keanu frowned, his mind racing. What had happened to the captain? Why wasn't he communicating with the crew or the passengers? He walked down the aisle, his pace quickening. His thoughts were a blur. He had to figure out what was going on. Every instinct he had told him that the breakdown wasn't just a coincidence, and the truth, whatever it was buried somewhere in this plane. He reached the cockpit door and knocked twice. Hey, is everything all right in there? There was a long pause before a muffled voice responded, one Keanu didn't recognize. We're fine, Mr. Reeves. Everything's under control. Under control? Keanu repeated, his brow furrowing. The situation's not fine. You've got passengers panicking, and the pilot is out of commission. We need to talk. There was a moment of silence before the voice spoke again, and this time, Keanu could hear the edge of tension in it. We can't let anyone in right now. It's for everyone's safety. Keanu's patience was wearing thin. This was bigger than just protocol or safety measures. He needed answers. I'm not just a passenger here. I'm trying to help. The passengers are starting to report strange things. People are hearing voices and seeing things. We need to know what's really going on. A long sigh echoed through the door before the voice responded, softer this time. We're dealing with something we weren't prepared for, Mr. Reeves. I'll have someone explain it to you soon. Just stay where you are. Keanu didn't wait for more. The vague response only confirmed what he had suspected. The crew was hiding something. They knew more than they were letting on, and that was a dangerous game. He turned and started making his way back down the aisle. The air in the cabin felt heavy, like a storm was about to break. He could sense the rising fear in the passengers around him, even as they tried to maintain some semblance of calm. The tension was suffocating. As he passed by one of the flight attendants, Keanu caught a glimpse of her face, wide-eyed, nervous, and pale. She was gripping the armrest of a seat as if it was her only anchor to reality. Sarah hesitated for a moment before replying, her voice trembling. And some of the passengers are starting to see things too. I don't know if it's just panic or if it's something else, but it's spreading. People are whispering, talking about shadows, about figures moving in the aisle. It's getting worse. Keanu felt the blood drain from his face. The passengers weren't just feeling the tension. They were experiencing something otherworldly. He stood up straight, his mind set. Something was happening on this flight, something that went beyond mere stress or mental illness. Nathan had been right about one thing. Someone was watching, and if Keanu didn't figure out who or what they were, the consequences could be catastrophic. Keanu's heart pounded in his chest as he stood frozen, processing Sarah's words. The unsettling idea that more passengers were now experiencing strange visions, that the plane itself could be caught in the middle of something far beyond comprehension, weighed heavily on him. It wasn't just Nathan's breakdown anymore. The situation had escalated to something far more disturbing. The whispers, the strange figures, the shadows in the aisles. It felt like the stuff of nightmares. But it was real, and it was happening right now. He clenched his jaw and took a steadying breath. He couldn't afford to lose his cool. He needed to think, to understand what was going on before it all spiraled out of control. If Nathan was right, if these watchers were more than just a delusion, then everyone on board was in danger. And if the passengers were starting to see things too, well, that only confirmed his worst fears. The small cabin seemed to grow smaller by the second. Passengers had begun whispering nervously to one another, casting anxious glances toward the back of the plane. The air felt charged, as though everyone could sense something was wrong, but no one knew what. Keanu knew this was only the beginning. Whatever was happening, it was only going to get worse. He turned to Sarah, his voice low and urgent. "Do you know where the captain is? Where's the other crew member? We need to talk to them, figure out what's going on." Sarah glanced over her shoulder, looking worried. "The co-pilot is in the cockpit, but the door's locked. After the incident with Nathan, no one's been allowed near it. As for the captain, well, I don't know if he's in any condition to talk." "Are you okay?" Keanu asked, stopping in front of her. "You look like you've seen a ghost." She swallowed hard and shook her head. "I don't know what's happening, Mr. Reeves, but I swear, I just saw something move down the aisle. Something that wasn't there before. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but now I'm not so sure." Keanu felt a chill creep up his spine. He knew that whatever was happening wasn't confined to Nathan. It was affecting everyone. The very fabric of reality seemed to be bending in ways it shouldn't. "Did anyone else see it?" he asked, though he wasn't sure if he really wanted to know the answer. The flight attendant glanced nervously over her shoulder and nodded. "A few passengers did. They're talking about it in hushed voices, but I don't think anyone wants to acknowledge it. They're afraid." Keanu sighed. There it was again, the fear that hung in the air like a palpable fog, and he understood it. The unknown was terrifying, but the fact that people were seeing things, hallucinating, or perhaps experiencing something else entirely, meant that whatever was going on, it was real, and it was happening to everyone. Keanu rubbed his temples, trying to think. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the plane had been exposed to something, some sort of virus or environmental hazard. But the way everyone was acting, the fear, the visions, it didn't add up. No, this wasn't just a medical issue. It wasn't just a breakdown of the mind. Something far darker was taking shape here. Suddenly, the overhead lights flickered once, then twice. The low hum of the airplane engines seemed to grow louder, more erratic, as if something was interfering with the aircraft's systems. Another jerk of the plane sent the passengers scrambling in their seats. Keanu's heart rate spiked as the plane seemed to dip, then recover. The tension in the cabin was unbearable. "Stay calm." The voice of the flight attendant echoed over the intercom, though it barely masked the edge of panic in her tone. "Please stay in your seats. We are handling the situation." But it was too late. Panic had already spread. From the corner of his eye, Keanu saw a shadow dart between the rows of seats. His breath caught in his chest. Was it just his mind playing tricks on him, or had someone, just moved in the aisle? He turned quickly, scanning the cabin, but the shadow was gone. All he saw were nervous, anxious faces. No one else seemed to have noticed. Or perhaps they had, but didn't want to acknowledge it. Suddenly, he heard a loud crash from the front of the plane, the cockpit. Keanu's instincts kicked in. Without thinking, he sprinted toward the cockpit door, adrenaline surging through him. Something was happening. something that no one on board could control. Whatever was inside the cockpit, whatever Nathan had been afraid of, it was starting to come for them all. Keanu's pulse raced as the crash from the cockpit echoed in the narrow cabin, shaking the walls like an ominous prelude to something even worse. The sound had been unmistakable, metallic, a sharp, dissonant noise that sent a wave of panic through the passengers. He didn't need to look at their faces to know that everyone was thinking the same thing. What the hell is going on? He reached the cockpit door in a few swift steps, his hand pressing urgently against the cold steel handle. But it didn't budge. His first instinct was to knock, but after everything that had happened, knocking felt like a futile gesture. If anything, it would delay the answers everyone so desperately needed. "Hello?" Keanu called out, voice firm but edged with urgency. "Captain? Co-pilot?" A strained voice called back, this time more frantic than before. "Mr. Reeves, stay away. You don't understand. You have to stay away." Keanu's mind raced, and fear tugged at him. What the hell was going on in there? The passengers weren't the only ones on edge. The flight crew seemed to be unraveling, too. Ignoring the warning, Keanu gripped the door handle again, this time forcing it downward with all his might. The door was heavier than it should have been, as if something inside was pushing back against it. But after several moments of struggling, he managed to get it open just enough to slip inside. What he found was nothing like he had imagined. The cockpit was in chaos. Papers were scattered across the floor, the control panels were flashing erratically, and the atmosphere was thick with a sense of impending doom. The co-pilot, a young man who appeared to be in his late 20s, was hunched over the controls, eyes wide and bloodshot. His breathing was rapid, almost hyperventilating. His hands gripped the yoke tightly, as though he feared letting go would send the plane spiraling out of control. The captain was slumped in his chair, his face pale and drawn, eyes vacant, as if his mind had completely shut down. His hands rested limply in his lap, a single piece of paper clutched tightly in one of them. Keanu could see the faint tremors that shook the captain's fingers, even from where he stood. The co-pilot suddenly lurched to his feet, his eyes wide with terror. "They're coming for us all," he said, his voice shaking. "The whispers, they never stop. They're inside my head, inside all of us. And now we're trapped." Keanu's heart raced as he realized the gravity of the situation. The plane wasn't malfunctioning due to some technical fault. It was being controlled, manipulated by forces that were far beyond anything he could comprehend. A high-pitched whine suddenly cut through the cockpit, louder than the hum, more piercing. Keanu's ears rang, and for a moment, he thought he might lose consciousness. The co-pilot fell to his knees, clutching his head in agony. "No, no, please," he begged, as if pleading with something unseen. The shadowy figure advanced, the air around it growing colder with every step. Keanu's instinct screamed at him to run, but his feet wouldn't move. It was as if something was keeping him in place, locking him in a moment of frozen terror. And then, in a voice that sounded like 1,000 whispers blending into one, the figure spoke. "You've seen us. Now, you must join us." Keanu's breath caught in his throat. The words were chilling, filled with a cold finality that sent waves of panic through his entire body. There was no escape. Not now. The watchers had been waiting. They had been watching for far longer than any of them could have known, and now they had come for them. But just as the figure reached out toward him, the lights flickered violently. The cockpit door slammed shut with a deafening crash, sending Keanu stumbling back. His head collided with the wall of the narrow hallway, and for a moment, everything went black. Keanu slowly regained consciousness, his head throbbing as he blinked against the harsh overhead lights. His mind was foggy, struggling to process the sheer horror of what he had just witnessed. The cockpit, the shadowy figure, the whispers. He still felt the coldness of that eerie voice reverberating in his chest, like it was clawing its way into his soul. For a moment, he lay still, his eyes closed, taking in the disorienting, muted hum of the plane's engines. The lights flickered again, briefly plunging the cabin into darkness before they stabilized. The co-pilot looked up briefly as Keanu entered, his eyes wide with terror. We're losing control of the plane, he gasped. The systems are malfunctioning. It's them. Keanu's heart skipped a beat. Them? Who are you talking about? He demanded, stepping closer, trying to make sense of the chaos. What happened to the captain? The co-pilot glanced at the captain, his face filled with horror. The captain. He's been taken, the co-pilot whispered. We all have, in a way. But he saw them first. He saw them before the rest of us did. Keanu felt a cold chill crawl down his spine. Saw who? Before the co-pilot could answer, a loud, eerie hum filled the cockpit. It was a low, vibrating sound that seemed to reverberate through the very walls of the plane. The instruments flickered wildly, and the warning lights started to flash red in rapid succession. The hum intensified, growing louder and more oppressive. It was as if the very air around them was charged with some kind of energy that defied explanation. Keanu's thoughts raced. This couldn't be a malfunction. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't just a technical issue. There was something unnatural happening to the plane. And then he saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, a fleeting movement in the corner of his vision. But when Keanu turned to look more closely, the shadow solidified, taking the form of a figure standing just beyond the cockpit door. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, with a face that was obscured by an unsettlingly smooth, featureless mask. The figure was surrounded by a strange, flickering light, almost like a mirage, as if it didn't belong in the same space as the rest of them. The co-pilot screamed, his voice breaking. There it is. It's them. Keanu stepped back, his mind racing. This wasn't just a hallucination. The figure in front of him, it was real. The figure moved then, gliding silently across the cockpit, its steps unnaturally fluid. The light around it flickered like a faulty bulb, casting long, strange shadows across the walls. Keanu could feel a sense of overwhelming dread settle in his chest. This was no ordinary being. It was something from a different world. An entity, a watcher, whatever it was here now. And it wasn't alone. He sat up with a groan, rubbing his aching forehead. His vision was blurry at first, but as it cleared, he realized he was lying on the floor of the plane's narrow corridor. The walls around him were coated in a faint layer of cold sweat, and a strange, uneasy stillness had settled over the cabin. Had it all been a dream? Was he just imagining the events unfolding around him? He shook his head, pushing the thought aside. No, this was no dream. What happened in the cockpit had been real, and the presence, the thing that called itself one of the Watchers, was still here. Somewhere. Watching. Keanu pushed himself to his feet, disoriented but driven by a primal urge to understand what was happening. He had to know what was controlling this plane, and what it wanted from them. He stumbled down the aisle, his steps faltering, but he could feel the eyes of the passengers on him. The quiet murmur of anxious voices filled the air, but there was no comfort in their whispers. Fear had become contagious, spreading like wildfire among the travelers. Everyone was on edge. No one felt safe. The flight attendants, who had been trying to maintain a semblance of calm, now looked just as terrified as the passengers. They moved cautiously, casting wary glances at the rows of seats as if expecting someone, to emerge from the shadows at any moment. Keanu made his way toward the rear of the plane, where Sarah had been earlier. He needed her. She had been on the front lines with him in the chaos, and maybe, just maybe, she could shed some light on what had happened to him in the cockpit. He found her near the back, standing in front of a row of seats, her hand gripping the armrest as if for support. Her face was pale, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and fear. Sarah, Keanu said, his voice strained. What the hell is going on here? I saw it. The thing in the cockpit. It spoke to me. It wanted me to join them. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke, but he didn't care. He had to get the words out. Do you know what it is? What's happening to us? Sarah didn't immediately respond. She just stared at him for a long moment, her eyes reflecting a deep, haunted understanding. Then, slowly, she shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know. I don't know what it is either, Keanu. But I think it's been here for a while. Maybe longer than we know. Keanu's heart sank as he watched Sarah's lips tremble. He had a feeling she knew more than she was letting on, but he could see the fear in her eyes, too. She was scared. She wasn't just confused or uncertain. She was terrified. Are you telling me the crew knew about this? That they've seen it before, he pressed, his voice growing more urgent. Sarah hesitated, glancing around as if the shadows themselves might be listening. Not all of them. I think some of them, like the captain, had an idea, but I don't know for sure. I just know that when I went to the back of the plane earlier, I heard the crew talking in hushed voices. They were talking about things that didn't make sense. They were trying to keep it quiet, but they couldn't hide the panic in their voices. Keanu's gut tightened. The more he learned, the more it became clear. Whatever was controlling this plane, whatever had targeted them, was far older and more dangerous than he could ever have imagined. But it wasn't just the crew. Something was happening to the passengers, too. Something strange, something none of them had ever experienced before. As if on cue, the lights flickered again, longer this time, and a chill swept through the cabin, causing Keanu to shiver involuntarily. The temperature had dropped. He could see his breath now, a faint mist in the air. And then, he heard it, the soft, low hum that filled the space. It wasn't coming from the plane itself. It was coming from within the cabin. A hum that seemed to resonate through his very bones. Everyone in the cabin was frozen, staring at each other in horror. Some passengers began to mutter nervously. Others gripped their seats tightly, as though bracing for impact. The unsettling hum continued, growing in pitch, before the walls of the plane seemed to vibrate with an unnatural force. And then it happened. A shadow, long and fluid, slithered across the ceiling. No one could see where it came from, but everyone could feel it. The air grew thicker, heavier, like something had invaded their space, something that didn't belong in the physical world. "What is that?" someone shouted from the front. Panic erupted. The flight attendants screamed, rushing down the aisles in frantic attempts to maintain order, but the shadow stretched and shifted, defying all logic. It seemed to pulse, then dissipate before reappearing in different parts of the plane. It was no longer a shadow. It was moving, and it was coming closer. Keanu grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her toward him as the chaos unfolded around them. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew one thing for sure. The passengers were no longer the only ones in danger. Whatever was in control of this plane had plans for all of them, and they were closing in. The overhead lights flickered once more, casting an eerie, sickly yellow glow over the cabin. A voice suddenly boomed from the speakers, distorted and garbled, but its intent was clear. "Your journey ends here." The sound of those words, the finality of them, sank into Keanu's chest like a cold weight. He could feel the presence of the watchers surrounding them, closing in. They had arrived. And now, it was time to pay the price. The voice over the intercom cut through the cabin like a jagged knife, its echo lingering in the air long after the words had been spoken. "Your journey ends here." The ominous proclamation sent shivers down Keanu's spine, and he could feel the atmosphere shift, a palpable weight pressing against his chest. The plane had never felt so unnatural, as if the very air itself had become something alien. Around him, the passengers were in full panic mode. Some screamed, clutching their seatbelts like life vests in a storm, while others were frozen, staring wide-eyed at the shadows crawling along the edges of the cabin. The shadowy figures, those whispers in the dark, were no longer just figments of imagination. They were real, and they were getting closer. Keanu tightened his grip on Sarah's arm as he pulled her toward a nearby exit. His mind was racing. There had to be something he could do. He couldn't just stand by and watch as the plane descended into chaos. He had to fight back. But how? How could he fight something that didn't belong in this world? The overhead lights flickered again, bathing the cabin in a sickly yellow glow. He could hear the whispers now, far louder than before. The sound seemed to crawl under his skin, burrowing into his brain. They were everywhere, but no one was speaking. It was as if the words were coming from all directions, a voice without a face. "Keanu!" Sarah's voice trembled as she looked around, wide-eyed with fear. "What are we supposed to do? How do we stop this?" Keanu didn't have an answer. What could he say? That they needed to fight something they didn't even understand? That they needed to survive a force beyond their comprehension? He was just as lost as she was, but he couldn't afford to show weakness now. Not in front of her. Not in front of the other passengers. "We need to get to the cockpit," he said, his voice low but firm. "We need to talk to the co-pilot, figure out what the hell is going on. This plane isn't just malfunctioning. It's being controlled by something." Sarah's eyes widened. "You think it's controlling the entire plane?" "Something like that," Keanu muttered, pulling her toward the front of the plane. As they walked, the shadows seemed to writhe in the corners of his vision, shifting and contorting. They were watching him, following him, but no matter how hard he looked, he couldn't catch more than a glimpse. Every time he thought he saw one of them, it would disappear, fading into the darkness like it never existed. As they approached the cockpit, Keanu's mind spun. The door was still locked, and he could hear muffled voices from within. Urgent, panicked voices. He pressed his ear to the door, trying to make sense of the sounds, but all he could catch were fragments. No control. "It's coming, Keanu," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Do you think they're in there with them?" Keanu's stomach twisted. He had no idea. The possibility that whatever was tormenting them might have already overtaken the crew made him sick. They couldn't just barge in blindly. They needed a plan. "We need to find another way in," he said, his mind working overtime. But before he could finish speaking, the plane lurched violently, throwing both of them forward. Keanu's stomach dropped as the familiar hum of the engines warped into a low growl, like some otherworldly creature had latched onto the plane and was squeezing it for all it was worth. The overhead lights blinked again. This time, they didn't return. The cabin was plunged into darkness. Screams erupted, and the sound of frantic footsteps echoed through the aisle. "Stay calm," Keanu shouted, though the words felt hollow in the chaos. "Stay in your seats." But even as the words left his mouth, Keanu knew it was too late. The panic was already spreading like wildfire, and there was no stopping it now. Passengers scrambled to unbuckle their seatbelts, racing for the exits in a desperate attempt to escape. But where could they go? There was nowhere to run on a plane thousands of feet in the air. The plane lurched again, and this time, it felt different, more violent. Keanu braced himself against the nearest seat, his heart pounding in his chest. Through the cracks in the walls, he could hear them. Whispers, louder now, coming from all around the plane. The watchers were here. They were inside the plane. Keanu's thoughts began to spiral. He had seen the shadows. He had heard the whispers. But this was something far worse. Whatever was controlling the plane was now fully awake, and it wasn't just a force. It was a presence. Something ancient, something that had been waiting, watching. He turned to Sarah, her face pale and panicked. "We need to get inside that cockpit. We don't have much time." The flight attendants were now in full panic mode, darting up and down the aisles, trying to keep some semblance of order, but it was clear that they had lost control of the situation. A few of them were clutching the intercom, their faces filled with terror as they tried to contact the cockpit, but the lines were dead. Keanu grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her toward the cockpit again, this time determined to get inside. They couldn't just wait for someone else to fix this. Whatever was going on, they needed to take charge. The door was still locked, but Keanu could see the co-pilot through the glass. His face was pale, his eyes wide in terror as he looked back at Keanu, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "You have to fight it," Keanu said, his voice more forceful than he felt. He turned to Sarah, her face reflecting the same anxiety he felt in his gut. "We can't just sit here." Sarah's eyes flicked toward the cockpit door. The terror in her face mirrored his own, but there was something else there too, a deep, quiet determination. She wasn't about to give in, not now. "I don't understand," Sarah whispered, stepping forward cautiously. "How did this happen? How could this thing take over the plane?" Keanu opened his mouth to answer, but then he saw the thing again, the shadow that had been lurking just beyond their sight. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It had a form, a structure that defied all sense of logic. There was something alien about it, like an entity from another realm entirely, not bound by the laws of physics or reality. It wasn't just haunting the cockpit. It was feeding on the fear. That's what Keanu realized. The passengers, the crew, they were nothing more than a buffet for this thing, a source of energy. And the more they panicked, the more it grew stronger. His hands clenched into fists. They couldn't let it feed. They couldn't let it win. "We fight," Keanu said, more to himself than anyone else. "We fight until the end." With that, he rushed forward, ignoring the voice in his head warning him to stop. He grabbed the co-pilot by the shoulders, shaking him violently. "Look at me," Keanu commanded. "Snap out of it. You're still in there." For a long, terrifying moment, the co-pilot remained frozen, his gaze locked onto the shadow in the corner. But then, as if waking from a trance, his eyes flicked back to Keanu. There was a flicker of recognition, a hint of humanity, before the darkness overtook him again. "I can't," the co-pilot muttered, his voice hollow. "It's too strong. It's too late." Keanu's stomach twisted. He had seen the co-pilot's face, a man who had once been in control, calm and collected, now reduced to a shell of himself. He had no idea how this thing worked, how it was capable of taking over so completely. But he knew one thing for sure. It was only getting worse. Keanu turned to Sarah, who stood with her arms wrapped tightly around her body. "We have to do something." "Anything," he said, his voice urgent. "This plane isn't going to land by itself. We're going to have to find a way to stop it before we all crash." Sarah nodded, but her eyes betrayed her fear. "But how? We don't even know what it is. How do you fight something like that?" Keanu slammed his fist against the door. "Let me in," he shouted, but the co-pilot didn't move. His gaze was distant, unfocused, like he wasn't even seeing Keanu anymore. Then, with a sickening jolt, the door to the cockpit slid open by itself. Keanu's heart skipped a beat. Something, or someone, had opened it. Inside the cockpit, the lights were flickering erratically, the flight instruments wildly spinning, the plane's controls seemingly malfunctioning with no rhyme or reason. The captain was still slumped in his seat, his face pale, his hands still locked in his lap. The co-pilot, however, was standing rigid, as if frozen in place. Then Keanu saw it. In the far corner of the cockpit, a shadowy figure hovered, its form indistinct, flickering in and out of existence like a malfunctioning TV screen. The presence was there, unmistakably real, and it was watching him. The co-pilot's eyes darted toward Keanu, and for the briefest of moments, they locked. But then the co-pilot's gaze fell back to the shadow in the corner, his expression unreadable. "It's too late," the co-pilot whispered, his voice strained. "We can't stop it. It's already inside." Keanu felt a shiver crawl down his spine. Whatever this was, it wasn't just an entity. It was an infection, a malevolent force, and it had taken over the plane. But Keanu wasn't ready to give up. "We're not giving up," he muttered to himself, stepping forward, determined to fight back. The co-pilot's whisper echoed in Keanu's mind as he stepped cautiously into the cockpit. "We can't stop it. It's already inside." Keanu's heart pounded in his chest, each beat driving him further into the nightmare he couldn't escape. The shadowy figure in the corner seemed to pulse, its form twisting in unnatural ways as it hovered just beyond the threshold of his perception. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the very atmosphere had turned against him. The co-pilot's eyes were wide with terror, his face pale as he stared at the figure in the corner of the cockpit. Keanu could see that the man was no longer in control of his body. His movements were stiff, jerky, like a puppet on strings. Keanu's mind raced. He wasn't sure if they could fight it, but they sure as hell couldn't give up. He turned toward the cockpit door, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "We'll figure it out. But first, we need to find out what it wants. What's its goal?" He barely finished the sentence when the entire plane jolted violently, throwing them both off balance. The seats shuddered as if the plane were being yanked from all sides. A scream from the rear of the cabin echoed through the walls, followed by another and another. Panic had escalated. "We're losing control," one of the flight attendants yelled, her voice shrill. "We need to land now." Keanu's heart skipped. They were too high up. The plane wasn't going to just land on its own. The shadows had sabotaged everything, made every system unreliable. The fear that had been building in him for the last few hours was now a full-blown panic, creeping into his bones. Was it too late for them? But then he remembered what he'd seen when he first woke up in the plane. The instruments, the cockpit lights blinking erratically. The entire plane was a vessel, but the shadow had more control over it than he could have imagined. And if he didn't stop it, they would crash before they even had a chance to land safely. There had to be a way to fight back. "Sarah, listen to me," Keanu said, his voice steadying. "I think this thing is controlling everything on the plane. Not just the crew, everything. We need to find the power grid, the main controls. If we can cut off its access, we might be able to stop it." She nodded, her expression darkening. "So, we're going after the heart of it, huh? Just like that?" "Just like that," Keanu replied, determination now burning in his chest. "We don't have a choice. We fight to the end." He grabbed her hand and pulled her back toward the main aisle, but before they could take a single step, the air shifted again. This time, it wasn't just the pressure from the outside forces. It was the presence of the shadows, suffocating, heavier than ever before. Keanu could hear their voices now, a chorus of whispers too garbled to understand, but somehow, they weren't just in the air. They were in his mind. "You cannot stop us," a voice hissed, louder than the others. "You are nothing, just like the rest." Keanu's chest tightened, and his breath caught in his throat. The voice had come from inside his mind. It was speaking directly to him. He closed his eyes for a moment, gritting his teeth. He couldn't let it get to him. Whatever this thing was, whatever it wanted, he wasn't going to be its victim. He wasn't going to let it control him. He opened his eyes, meeting Sarah's gaze. She was shaking, but there was a fierce fire in her eyes now. "Let's do this," she said, her voice trembling but determined. Keanu nodded and turned toward the rear of the plane. Together, with every step, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. The closer they got to the plane's heart, the more intense the pressure became. But Keanu didn't look back. The shadows could whisper all they wanted, but they weren't going to win. The corridors of the plane felt like a maze now, a twisted nightmare that Keanu and Sarah were forced to navigate through, with shadows flickering at the edge of their vision. The whispers continued to haunt them, a cacophony of voices in their minds, disorienting, maddening. Each step they took seemed to draw them deeper into the heart of the madness. The passengers were in chaos. Some had already given in, their faces blank as if they had succumbed to the dark force that had overtaken the plane. Others were still fighting, desperately trying to get to the exits, but the aisles were choked with panic-stricken bodies. The flight attendants, too, seemed to be in some sort of trance, moving mechanically, their eyes hollow as they served the entity's will. They no longer acted as human beings, but as puppets, marionettes controlled by some unseen force. "Keanu!" Sarah's voice cut through the madness, low but clear. He turned toward her, and for the briefest of moments, their eyes locked, sharing the same silent understanding. They were in this together. There was no turning back now. They were approaching the rear of the plane, the location of the central power grid. Keanu could feel the intensity of the shadows growing stronger with every step. The closer they got, the more oppressive the air became. It felt like a pressure was building, as if the very walls of the aircraft were closing in around them. Keanu tightened his grip on Sarah's hand. "We can do this," he muttered, mostly to himself. "We have to." They reached the hatch that led to the maintenance area. A flickering emergency light illuminated the space, casting eerie shadows across the steel walls. Keanu's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in short bursts. He could feel the presence now more than ever, a suffocating, cold energy that seemed to pulse through the very air. "Ready?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with anxiety. Keanu nodded, his mind made up. "Let's end this." The hatch opened with a loud hiss, and they stepped inside. The area was filled with rows of control panels, all flashing with erratic lights. The plane's systems were in complete disarray, the once steady hum of the engines now replaced by a low, menacing growl. The power grid was a sprawling mess of wires and circuits, and Keanu knew that somewhere in the tangled mess, the entity had taken root. "It's here," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "It's all around us." Keanu scanned the room, his eyes darting from one flashing light to another. There had to be a way to disrupt the entity's control, something they could do to sever its hold on the plane. He approached one of the control panels, running his fingers over the cold metal. The buttons and switches were all flickering in and out of existence, as if the plane itself was alive, fighting against them. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the very walls were closing in on him. "You can't escape." The voice, deep, guttural, rumbled in Keanu's mind, sending chills down his spine. It wasn't just a voice. It was a presence, an overwhelming force that was trying to take over his thoughts, his will. It was as if the shadow was speaking directly to him, taunting him, feeding off his fear. Keanu clenched his jaw, refusing to give in. "I'm not afraid of you," he muttered, though his hands were shaking as he reached for the emergency override switch. He had to stop this. There had to be a way to disconnect the entity from the power grid. With a deep breath, he slammed his hand down on the switch. The entire room seemed to shudder, and the flickering lights dimmed for a moment. For a brief instant, it felt like they had succeeded. But then, the room was plunged into darkness. "You are nothing." The voice came again, louder now, echoing through the cabin like a thunderous roar. It wasn't just in his mind this time. It was in the very air around them. Sarah screamed, and Keanu turned to see her stumbling back, her eyes wide with terror. The shadows had taken physical form now, dark, writhing masses that seemed to stretch and twist like black smoke. The presence was here, and it was angry. Keanu's heart raced as he grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her back toward the exit. They had to get out of there, had to find a way to escape this madness. But as they moved, the walls seemed to close in around them, and the air grew heavier with each passing second. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the shadows withdrew. The darkness lifted, and the lights flickered back on, casting a sickly glow over the maintenance room. Keanu and Sarah stood frozen, their breath ragged as they processed what had just happened. The presence had receded, but it wasn't gone. It was still there, lurking just beyond the edge of their perception. "That was close," Sarah said, her voice shaky. "What the hell was that?" Keanu swallowed hard, his mind spinning. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice low. "But it's not over. We've only just begun." Suddenly, a loud crackling sound filled the air, followed by an explosion of noise. The plane lurched violently again, throwing them both off balance. Keanu grabbed the nearest control panel to steady himself, his heart racing as the entire plane seemed to convulse beneath him. "We're losing control again," Sarah shouted, panic creeping into her voice. "What the hell is happening?" Keanu's mind was reeling. He had hoped that cutting the power would stop the entity, but it was clear now that the shadow wasn't just controlling the systems, it was controlling the plane itself. Every system, every part of the plane, was under its sway, and it wasn't going to let them win. "We need to find the source," Keanu said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. "We need to get to the heart of this thing before it's too late." With one last glance toward the power grid, Keanu turned toward the exit. The shadows were moving again, stretching and twisting in the corners of the room like dark tendrils searching for a victim. The entity was awake, and it was hungry, but Keanu wasn't going to let it win. He and Sarah had come this far. They couldn't stop now. The air was thick, stifling, as Keanu and Sarah made their way back through the narrow aisle, the floor beneath them trembling with the violent shake of the plane. Keanu's mind raced as the reality of their situation set in. They had made a brief strike against the entity, but it was far from over. The shadows, those dark and unnatural forces, were still very much in control. It was clear now, this wasn't just a fight to save the plane. It was a fight for their lives. Each step was measured. The sounds of chaos grew louder as they neared the cabin, the screams and panicked shouts of passengers spilling into the hallway. It was as if the fear of the passengers was feeding the entity, making it stronger, more persistent. The plane's descent seemed to be accelerating, the angle of the fall sharp and terrifying. "We need to stop it now," Sarah said, her voice tight with fear. The desperation in her tone was evident. Keanu could see it in her eyes. She was exhausted, both physically and mentally, but she wasn't about to give up. Keanu nodded grimly. They were running out of time. We have to get to the cockpit. If we can regain control of the plane, we might be able to break the entity's hold on it. Sarah's face paled, but she didn't hesitate. Let's go. They moved quickly, dodging people who had become completely consumed by fear. Some of them were curled up in the aisles, others were pacing in wild distress. Keanu's stomach churned as he saw the once proud passengers of Flight 308 reduced to nothing more than scared, lost souls. The shadowy figure had claimed them all, and now it was after him. They reached the cockpit door, but before Keanu could touch the handle, the door burst open with a violent crash, and the co-pilot, still under the entity's control, staggered out. His eyes were wide and unseeing, his face twisted into an expression of pure terror. He moved like a puppet, jerking violently as if the shadows themselves were puppeteering his every movement. "Get away!" Keanu shouted, instinctively pulling Sarah back. He's not himself. The co-pilot's head twisted unnaturally as he looked at them, his mouth gaping open in a silent scream. But there was no recognition in his eyes, just emptiness. The entity had taken complete control. For a moment, Keanu felt his resolve falter. How could they fight something like this? How could they possibly stop an entity that could control minds so completely, so effortlessly? But then he remembered what he had to do. He couldn't back down now. If they didn't fight back, if they didn't take control, the plane would fall, taking them all down with it. "Sarah," he said, his voice more determined than ever, "get to the controls. I'll handle him." Without waiting for her response, Keanu shoved the co-pilot aside, his heart pounding in his chest. The co-pilot collapsed to the floor, his body still twitching and jerking in the grips of the entity's hold. Keanu knew he didn't have much time before the shadow regained control. Sarah, looking unsure but resolute, ran toward the cockpit's main console, her fingers flying over the controls. The plane lurched again, a violent shake that threw Keanu off balance. But he gritted his teeth and turned toward the co-pilot. This wasn't just about surviving. It was about taking back what had been stolen from them, their control over their own fate. Keanu approached the co-pilot cautiously, his eyes scanning the man's twitching form. He knew that the shadows had to be forced out. They weren't just going to give up. But how? "You're weak," a voice hissed inside his head. "You can't stop me." Keanu flinched, the voice cutting through him like a knife. It was the entity, trying to break his will, trying to make him doubt himself. But Keanu wasn't going to let it win. "You're wrong," Keanu muttered under his breath. He reached down and grabbed the co-pilot by the shoulders, shaking him. "Snap out of it." For a long, tense moment, nothing happened. But then, slowly, the co-pilot's eyes blinked, a flicker of recognition flashing behind them. "Keanu?" the co-pilot rasped, his voice faint and weak. Keanu let out a relieved breath. "Yes, it's me. Listen to me. You're still in there. You have to fight this thing. You have to get up." The co-pilot's body trembled, but there was no more resistance. He pushed himself to his feet, his movements stiff and shaky. The shadow inside him was still there, but it was weakening. Keanu glanced back toward the cockpit, where Sarah was still working on the controls. The plane's descent was slowing slightly, but the emergency lights were flashing frantically, signaling that they were running out of time. The entity wasn't done yet. "We need to regain control," Keanu said, pulling the co-pilot toward the cockpit. "Now." Together, they stumbled into the cockpit, where Sarah was still battling the malfunctioning systems. The controls were a mess, buttons and levers malfunctioning, lights flashing in erratic patterns. "How's it looking?" Keanu asked, gripping the side of the seat. "Not good," Sarah replied, her voice strained. "I've tried everything, but it's like the plane's systems are rejecting my commands. It's almost like the entity is feeding off the electrical systems." Keanu cursed under his breath. Of course, the entity wasn't just controlling people. It was using the plane's own systems as a conduit, making it stronger. "We can't let it win," he said, determination hardening his tone. We need to break its connection to the plane systems. There's no other way. Sarah looked at him, her eyes wide with fear. How? We're not even sure what this thing is, Keanu. What if we're just making it worse? We have to try, Keanu replied. We're running out of options. Without another word, he turned toward the co-pilot, who was staring blankly at the control panel. Do you remember how to reset the power grid manually? Keanu asked. The co-pilot blinked, his face paling again. He nodded slowly. Yes, I can do that, but it won't be easy. It doesn't matter, Keanu said, his voice urgent. Just do it. We need to stop this thing. The co-pilot staggered to his feet, moving toward a panel on the wall. He pressed a sequence of buttons, and the entire cockpit seemed to hum with the strain of restarting the plane's electrical systems. The plane shook again, harder this time. Keanu could hear the roar of the engines as the descent began to accelerate once more. The voice of the entity rang out in his mind, louder and more vicious than before. You will fail, it growled. Nothing can stop me. But Keanu refused to give in. He wasn't about to let this thing take him down, not when he still had a chance. With the co-pilot working furiously on the controls, Keanu's gaze flicked to Sarah, who was clutching the joystick with white knuckles. Stay strong, he whispered. We're almost there. The battle wasn't over, but they still had a shot at taking back control. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The control panel in front of Keanu was an ominous display of flashing lights and malfunctioning systems. Sarah's hands moved rapidly across the joystick, her face a mask of concentration, but the plane's violent descent refused to relent. Every attempt she made to stabilize the aircraft was thwarted by the entity, the dark force that seemed to have a grip on every component of the plane. Keanu could feel his pulse racing in his neck, the pressure in his chest building. He had no idea how much longer they could last. The emergency lights cast long shadows across the cockpit, and the growls of the entity reverberated through his mind, a constant, taunting reminder that they were running out of time. Beside him, the co-pilot was slumped over the control panel, his hands shaking as he tried to reset the power grid. Sweat dripped from his brow, and his breath came in ragged gasps. The shadow that had overtaken him was still there, a dark cloud lurking at the edge of his consciousness, but he was fighting it. At least, Keanu hoped he was. You're doing great, Keanu said, trying to encourage the co-pilot. Keep pushing. We can break this. The co-pilot didn't respond immediately, but after a long, strained moment, he nodded. I think I've got it. Just a little more. Keanu could hear the tremor in his voice, and for a moment, doubt began to gnaw at him. Would it be enough? Was this fight even winnable? Then, the sound of Sarah's voice cut through the fog of his thoughts. Keanu, we've got a problem. He turned to her, his eyes locking onto hers. She was still gripping the joystick, her knuckles white, but her eyes were wide with fear. What do you mean? He asked, his heart skipping a beat. The altitude, Sarah replied. We're losing too much too fast. The engines are failing again. I can't keep us level. Keanu felt his stomach drop. The plane was plummeting again, faster this time. The entity was trying to force its will upon them, using every system on the plane to its advantage. The situation was growing direr by the second. I need more time, the co-pilot rasped. Just give me a little more time. The desperation in his voice sent a wave of anxiety through Keanu. They had to act now, or they would all die. Keanu's mind raced as he glanced between Sarah and the co-pilot. It was a delicate balance between the two, but they had to break free of the entity's hold. If they didn't, they would be trapped, spiraling to their doom. Sarah, Keanu said, his voice steady despite the chaos. We need to get to the auxiliary controls. We can reset the entire system from there. Her eyes widened as she processed the plan. You think we can? There's no choice, Keanu interjected, cutting her off. We need to sever the connection to the entity. We don't have a lot of options. The two of them exchanged a brief, meaningful look. Time was slipping away. The cockpit was a whirlwind of sounds. The hum of malfunctioning equipment, the wailing of the emergency alarms, and the sporadic crashes of turbulence that shook the plane. Every noise seemed to push the entity's presence deeper into Keanu's mind, as though it were trying to tear apart his will, to destroy any shred of hope he had left. But Keanu refused to be swayed. He wasn't about to let the entity take everything. Not after everything they had already been through. "We'll do it together," Keanu said, nodding at Sarah. Without another word, Sarah stepped away from the joystick, moving toward the side panel that led to the auxiliary controls. Keanu followed close behind, keeping his eyes trained on the co-pilot. The man was struggling, his hands shaking more violently now as the entity inside him fought to regain control. But just as Keanu was about to reach the panel, a deep, guttural voice rang out again, louder this time, filling the cockpit with an overwhelming force. "You will fail." Keanu's entire body froze. The entity's voice was everywhere. Inside his mind, in the room, outside the plane. It was like an oppressive weight, trying to crush him under the pressure. It sounded as though the very fabric of reality was warping around them. "You can't escape me." Keanu's hands clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms. He wasn't going to listen. He wasn't going to let it win. He turned to Sarah, whose face had gone pale as she stared at the control panel in front of her. The shadows around them flickered, their forms growing more pronounced, coiling around the cabin like an unseen predator. But Sarah, despite her fear, was unyielding. "We can do this," Sarah said, her voice low but steady. "Just focus." Keanu nodded, trying to shake the lingering sense of dread that had gripped him. The entity was playing its games, trying to make them doubt themselves, but he couldn't afford to lose hope. Not now. The auxiliary panel flickered on, its light glowing faintly. Sarah quickly began pressing buttons, her hands moving with practiced precision. The plan was simple, but it required an enormous amount of energy. They would need to overload the backup systems, force a reboot of the entire plane, and break the entity's grip. Keanu watched her, heart hammering, as she worked. He could feel the pressure building again, an overwhelming force pulling at him, at them both. The entity was angry, and it wasn't going to let them succeed without a fight. Come on, Sarah muttered, her eyes flicking between the screens, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Sarah," Keanu began, but he was interrupted by a deafening sound. A violent crash from somewhere deep within the plane. The entire fuselage shuddered, throwing them both off balance. The entity was making its final move. The co-pilot, still struggling against the darkness inside him, suddenly screamed in agony. Keanu turned to him in horror as the man's body arched violently, his eyes wide and glassy. The shadows in the cockpit seemed to coalesce around him, thickening, becoming almost tangible as the entity pulled every last bit of life from the co-pilot's body. "No!" Keanu shouted, rushing to the man's side. But the co-pilot was no longer there. He was lost to the entity. The shadows seemed to shrink back as if feeding off his life force. But they weren't done. They were hungry. Keanu's pulse raced as the last of the man's light flickered out. And in that moment, he knew they had only one chance left. "Sarah," Keanu shouted, "we need to overload the system now." She nodded, eyes blazing with determination, and slammed her hand down on the final button. A low hum reverberated through the cockpit as the backup systems powered up, and for a brief, shining moment, the plane stabilized. But the entity was still there, deep, dark, and relentless. They weren't done yet. Not by a long shot. The emergency lights flickered once again, casting everything in an eerie, sickly glow. The hum of the overloaded systems reverberated throughout the cockpit, but it was no longer reassuring. The plane had stabilized for a moment, but the darkness that hung over them like a thick fog refused to dissipate. Keanu gritted his teeth and clenched his fists, the weight of the situation crushing him. The co-pilot was gone, his life snuffed out by the very entity they were fighting to contain. It felt like a cold, heartless reminder of what they were up against. But there was no time for grief. Not now. Beside him, Sarah was bent over the controls, her eyes scanning the screens as they flickered in and out of life. Sweat dripped from her brow, and her face was pale, the exhaustion evident in the lines beneath her eyes. But there was no quitting now. She was the only one left who could help him. Keanu, she said, her voice tight. The backup systems are holding, but we're still on a downward spiral. We can't keep this up much longer. We need to break its hold completely. Keanu turned to her, his face hardening with resolve. I know. We have to get the plane back online, fully. We can't keep hoping for a miracle. She nodded, biting her lip as she continued her frantic work, pushing buttons, flipping switches. Keanu could feel the entity watching them, a presence in the room that was just out of sight, lurking in the shadows. Its voice reverberated through his mind again, colder and sharper than ever before. You think you can escape me? You are nothing. I will not allow you to win. Keanu's hands trembled, the sound of the entity's voice cutting through his skull like a blade. It wanted him to break, wanted him to question everything. But Keanu refused to listen. He couldn't afford to. Sarah, we need to go to the main power grid, he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. We can't keep messing with the backups. We need to reset everything. She looked at him, her eyes filled with both fear and determination. It's a risk, Keanu. If we're wrong, if this doesn't work, we don't have another choice. His voice was firm, unwavering. It's now or never. Sarah swallowed hard but nodded, standing up from the panel and moving toward the cockpit door. Keanu followed, his heart pounding in his chest as he glanced over at the remains of the co-pilot. It hit him then. This wasn't just about saving the plane anymore. This was about saving everyone on board, every soul that had been dragged into this nightmare. They reached the hallway, which was now eerily silent compared to the chaos earlier. The passengers had either fallen silent in terror or succumbed to the entity's influence, their faces blank and lifeless. It was like walking through a tomb. Keanu's pulse quickened as they moved toward the stairwell that led down to the main power grid. Every step felt like an eternity, the heavy weight of their mission pressing down on him. The entity was still there, in the back of his mind, whispering its venomous promises of failure. You will never reach the core. You are mine. He gritted his teeth and blocked out the voice. There was no time to listen to it. No time for fear. Finally, they reached the control room where the main power grid was housed. It was a small, dimly lit space, but it was crucial. This was where they could truly shut down the entity's control over the plane. The grid was a massive tangle of wires, switches, and buttons. If they could overload this system, maybe, just maybe, they could force the entity to relinquish its hold. Sarah immediately moved to one of the panels, her fingers flying over the controls. This is it, she said quietly, her voice filled with both dread and hope. We're in. Keanu took a deep breath, his eyes darting to the door behind them. The shadows seemed to grow longer in the flickering light, swirling like a storm just beyond their reach. He could feel it coming, the final push, the moment where they would either succeed or fail. He wasn't about to fail. The hum of the systems grew louder, the whine of the machinery ringing in his ears as Sarah worked, her brow furrowed in concentration. She toggled a few switches, her fingers moving with quick precision, but then, a sudden crackle filled the air, and the lights above them flickered violently. Sarah! Keanu shouted. Hurry! I'm trying. She snapped back, her voice strained as she fought against the chaos. It's like the entity knows what we're doing. It's resisting everything I try. Keanu's eyes narrowed. It wasn't enough just to disable the power grid. The entity was feeding off of the very energy they were trying to disrupt. They had to find a way to separate the plane's systems from the entity's influence. Wait, he said, a thought sparking in his mind. The black box. It's the one system that isn't connected to the main grid. If we can isolate it, maybe we can block the entity's connection to the plane. Sarah turned to him, her eyes wide. The black box? You think it could help? It's our only shot, Keanu said, his voice resolute. We cut it off. The entity can't use it if we sever the link. Sarah didn't hesitate. She reached for a different set of controls, her fingers moving swiftly. A soft beeping filled the air as she toggled another switch. Keanu could feel the tension building as the seconds stretched on. Almost there, Sarah muttered under her breath. Then, with a final decisive press of a button. The beeping stopped, replaced by a deep hum. "Done," Sarah said, turning to face Keanu. Her face was pale, but there was a spark of something in her eyes. Hope, or at least the possibility of it. "We've isolated the black box. It's cut off from the entity." Keanu felt a rush of relief wash over him, but he knew they weren't out of the woods yet. The plane was still plummeting, the system still in disarray. But now, with the black box severed, they had a chance to regain control. Suddenly, a loud crash sounded from the cockpit, followed by a violent lurch of the plane. Keanu and Sarah were thrown forward, hitting the control panel. The lights flickered, and the hum of the systems died down, replaced by an eerie silence. "Keanu, what's happening?" Sarah gasped, clutching the panel for support. Keanu's heart skipped a beat as he turned toward the cockpit, his eyes wide in horror. The shadows had manifested again, but this time they were different. They were more solid, more tangible, like dark smoke swirling around the cockpit in a deadly dance. "I told you, you can't escape me," the entity's voice growled, louder and more menacing than ever. Keanu swallowed hard. This was it. This was the moment they had been preparing for. He turned to Sarah, his eyes filled with determination. "We finished this. Now." The entity had underestimated them. It had taken everything they had thrown at it and still clung to life. But Keanu wasn't going to let it win. Not now, not ever. They had one last chance. The cockpit was no longer just a room. It felt like the very heart of the plane had become a battleground. The shadows, once mere whispers of darkness, had now manifested into tangible forms, swirling around the walls and thickening in the air like a dense fog. Keanu could feel the presence of the entity growing stronger, pressing against him, trying to break his resolve. Sarah stood beside him, her face pale but resolute. She had worked tirelessly to sever the entity's control over the plane, but they were still deep in enemy territory. The black box was disconnected, the systems were isolated, but the force that had overtaken the aircraft was far from gone. It was angry now, more desperate, more vengeful than ever. "You cannot defeat me," the voice boomed again, louder this time, vibrating the very walls of the cockpit. "I am eternal. You are nothing." Keanu gritted his teeth. The entity's words were poison, but he wasn't listening anymore. He couldn't afford to. Every ounce of his being screamed for action, for resolution. They had fought for this moment, for the chance to take back control, and he wasn't going to let it slip through his fingers now. "We have to finish this," Keanu said, his voice firm, though it shook with the intensity of their situation. "Sarah, get to the auxiliary controls. I'll hold it off." Sarah nodded without hesitation, her eyes wide with fear and determination. She knew exactly what he was asking her to do. It was their last shot. The auxiliary controls were their only hope of resetting the plane's core systems, but it was a delicate procedure. They needed to reboot everything without allowing the entity to seize control again. It would take time, and in that time, Keanu had to keep the entity at bay. The hum of the plane's systems was deafening now, the constant flicker of lights casting a sickly, surreal glow across the cockpit. The shadows seemed to move with a life of their own, creeping along the walls like living tendrils. The entity was everywhere, inside the walls, inside his mind. "You can't stop what's already begun," the voice whispered now, soft but insistent. "I am inside you. I always have been." Keanu's heart skipped a beat, but he pushed the thought aside. He wasn't going to let the entity win by getting inside his head. It had already taken so much from him. The lives of the co-pilot and the passengers, his peace of mind. But he would not let it take his will. He turned to Sarah. "Go. I'll be right behind you." She hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding and sprinting toward the side door that led to the auxiliary control panel. Keanu's eyes followed her every step, his hands tight on the controls, his mind racing with calculations. Every second mattered. As Sarah disappeared into the hallway, Keanu felt the pressure build. The entity was closing in, its presence thickening in the air, pressing down on him. It was a malevolent force, determined to consume everything in its path. And then it came. The first wave hit him like a physical blow. He staggered back, a loud ringing filling his ears, his vision blurring as the shadows surrounded him, coiling like snakes. He could feel the entity's power pulling at him, trying to drag him into its darkness. "You may have won this time, Keanu Reeves." The voice was distant now, a shadow of its former self. "But I will return, and next time, you will not be able to stop me." Keanu's hands dropped from the controls, and he exhaled slowly, the weight of the last few hours crashing down on him. He didn't speak, but his eyes locked onto Sarah's as she emerged from the hallway, looking just as drained and relieved as he felt. For a long moment, they simply stood there, their eyes meeting in silent understanding. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. They had no illusions about the future. This entity had shown itself to be relentless, cunning, and persistent. But for now, they had the peace of knowing they had survived. Together, they had fought back. Together, they had saved the plane. "We did it," Sarah said softly, her voice raw with exhaustion. "It's over." Keanu nodded, his gaze drifting to the horizon outside the cockpit window, the first rays of dawn just beginning to break through the clouds. "Yeah," he whispered, his voice thick with the weight of everything that had happened. "For now." But as he looked out over the rising sun, a deep, unsettling thought gnawed at him. The entity may have been defeated, but it was far from gone. The quiet that followed was almost too much to bear. Keanu sat in the cockpit, his hands still gripped tightly on the controls as if he were afraid the moment he let go, everything would fall apart again. The steady hum of the plane's systems now felt strangely comforting after the madness they had just endured. The turbulence had stopped, and the shadows that once swirled around them seemed to have dissolved back into the ether, as if they had never been. But Keanu knew better. The entity may have been silenced for now, but its influence lingered in his mind like a scar. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike again. "Keanu?" Sarah's voice broke through the silence, tentative but filled with concern. She was standing in the doorway, her face pale and tired, her eyes red from exhaustion. "Are you okay?" He turned to her, his expression weary but steady. "Yeah, I'm fine." Sarah didn't look convinced, but she didn't press further. Instead, she took a seat beside him, her eyes scanning the controls. The plane was flying smoothly now, but there was a hollowness in the air, a void left by the battle they just fought. "It's over, right?" she asked quietly, as if afraid the answer might shatter the fragile peace they'd earned. "Give in," the entity coaxed, its voice now smooth and seductive. "You cannot resist me. You never could." Keanu's breath quickened as the entity's grip on him tightened. His hands shook, but he kept his resolve, refusing to fall under its influence. "You're wrong," he muttered to himself, the words a mantra to keep him focused. "I will never give in to you." The shadows writhed, snapping at him like living things, but he refused to move. He had been through too much to back down now. He had faced down the darkest of forces before and won, and this time wouldn't be any different. His grip tightened on the control yoke as another wave of energy surged through him. His vision blurred again, but he fought to stay focused. The lights flickered as if the plane itself were being torn apart by the force inside it. "Sarah, hurry!" Keanu shouted, though he wasn't sure if she could hear him through the storm of chaos around them. Every word felt like it was being swallowed by the shadows. Just as his strength began to wane, the entity roared. "You cannot escape me." Keanu staggered, his head spinning as the force tried to consume him. But at that moment, he heard the sound of the auxiliary control panel powering up, the hum of systems coming back to life, and the faintest spark of hope. Sarah. She was doing it. "No!" the entity screamed, its voice twisting in rage. "You cannot win." Keanu's hands moved to the controls, his mind focused purely on one thing, keeping the plane together long enough for Sarah to finish the reset. He was running on pure adrenaline now, his body trembling as he pushed every ounce of energy into holding off the entity. The shadows reached for him, but they were slowing now, their hold weakening as the power grid began to return. Keanu could feel the entity's grip faltering, its force growing weaker with every passing second. "No!" the entity hissed. You cannot. You cannot. Suddenly, the shadows recoiled, and for the first time since this nightmare began, the cockpit felt almost normal. The power grid hummed, stable. The lights flickered one last time, then stabilized. The violent turbulence began to settle, and the plane, which had been spiraling toward disaster, finally started to level out. Keanu closed his eyes, taking a deep, steadying breath. The entity's presence was still there, but it was no longer a tangible force. It was fading, its influence slipping away with each passing moment. And then, a voice broke through the silence, louder than ever. Keanu hesitated before answering, his gaze fixed on the horizon outside the cockpit window. The sky was clear now, the first light of dawn spilling over the clouds, painting the world in shades of pink and orange. It should have been a beautiful sight, but all Keanu could think of was what had happened in the dark of the night, what they had almost lost. "I don't know," he said softly, the weight of the truth settling in his chest. "We're not out of the woods yet." Sarah looked at him, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What do you mean?" "The plane's safe. The power's back online. We're no longer plummeting to our deaths." He sighed and leaned back in his seat, his fingers still drumming nervously on the controls. "It's not just the plane I'm worried about, Sarah. It's what's still inside my head. That entity, it's not gone. It's still out there. And we have no idea how long it'll take before it comes back." For a long moment, Sarah didn't say anything. She simply stared at him, taking in his words, then nodded slowly. "I felt it too," she admitted, her voice almost a whisper. "When I was at the control panel, I thought I could still hear it, like it was whispering in my ear. But I didn't want to say anything. I thought it was just the stress." Keanu turned to look at her, his eyes dark with the realization that they were both trapped in the same nightmare. "It's more than just stress. It's in our minds, Sarah. We're not done yet. This thing doesn't just possess the plane. It possesses us too. And if we don't figure out how to destroy it for good, it'll never stop coming." The weight of his words hung in the air like an anchor. The air around them felt too still, too quiet, unnatural, even. The calm after a storm that they both knew wasn't over yet. "Then what do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice cracking under the strain of their shared fear. Keanu looked at her, his face drawn and tired. "I don't know, but I do know that we can't keep running from it. We need answers. We need to figure out what we're really up against and how to stop it for good." His mind raced as he thought back to everything they had experienced. The strange occurrences, the relentless push of the entity, the violent, unnerving whispers. He had thought that cutting the black box would sever the entity's hold, but now he realized it had only delayed the inevitable. What is it? What does it want from us? Before he could voice his thoughts, the radio crackled to life. It was a faint sound, distorted, but it was unmistakable, a voice. "Mayday, Mayday. This is Flight 42. We need immediate assistance. They're coming for us. There. The voice broke off in a strangled cry. Keanu's heart skipped a beat. It sounded like a distress signal from another flight, but the frequency was off. This wasn't standard air traffic communication. "Sarah, what is this?" he asked, his voice suddenly sharp with urgency. "I don't know," she said, her fingers flying over the radio controls. "It sounds like a distress signal, but I've never heard anything like it." Keanu stood up abruptly, his mind racing. His heart thudded in his chest. The signal had cut out abruptly, leaving nothing but static. But the message had been clear. "They're coming for us." He turned to Sarah, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Do you think—" "I don't know," Sarah interrupted, her voice tight with anxiety. "But it's connected. The entity. This distress signal, it sounds like it's from another plane, another crew. And if it's coming for them," Keanu's stomach twisted. The thought was too horrible to consider. "What if it's not just us?" he asked, his voice low and tense. "What if this thing is affecting other flights? What if it's bigger than we thought?" Sarah met his gaze, and the reality of their situation hit them both like a ton of bricks. They weren't the only ones trapped in this nightmare. The entity wasn't just after them. It was out there, somewhere, spreading its influence. Keanu felt a shiver run down his spine. The entity had tried to destroy them, to claim them as its own. But now, with this new distress signal, the implications were clear. They weren't alone. The darkness was out there, lurking, waiting for more victims to claim. "We need to warn them," Keanu said, his voice suddenly filled with urgency. "We have to find out where that plane is, where it's headed. We can't let this thing spread any further." Sarah nodded, her fingers already flying over the radio panel again. "I'll try to get a location. If there's any way we can help, we need to do it. Now." As the radio crackled again with another burst of static, Keanu gripped the edge of the cockpit seat. His mind raced, the weight of everything they had just survived pressing heavily on his chest. They had survived the first wave, but the battle was far from over. And this time, it was clear. The stakes were higher than ever. The silence in the cockpit was deafening, punctuated only by the soft hum of the plane's systems as Sarah scrambled to get a lock on the distress signal. Keanu paced back and forth, his mind racing with thoughts of what they had just discovered. The entity wasn't just contained to this flight. It was spreading, reaching out to others. They were just one small part of something much bigger, something much more dangerous. He could feel it, the weight of it, the dark force that seemed to pulse in the air around them, lingering like a shadow waiting to devour everything. "Keanu!" Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts, her hands shaking slightly as she looked up from the radio panel. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with shock and concern. "I found the flight. It's heading in the opposite direction, but it's close enough. About 3 hours out." Keanu's stomach tightened. 3 hours. That was far too long. They couldn't waste time. Not now. He leaned over Sarah's shoulder, glancing at the coordinates she had pulled up on the screen. "Is there any way to communicate with them directly? Warn them?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, biting her lip as she typed furiously on the keyboard. "I can try to establish a direct link, but it's risky. If that thing is as powerful as we think it is, it could mess with the communication systems. The signal might get corrupted or scrambled." Keanu didn't hesitate. "Do it. We don't have a choice. If they're out there, they need to know what they're up against." Sarah nodded, and her fingers flew across the panel, dialing in the frequencies, attempting to establish contact with the other plane. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours as the sound of static filled the cockpit. Then, finally, a voice crackled through the radio. "Mayday! Mayday! This is Flight 42. We're under attack. We need immediate assistance. They're everywhere." Keanu's heart skipped a beat. It was the same voice as before, but this time, the distress was palpable. The fear was unmistakable. "Sarah," Keanu said urgently, his hand gripping the armrest beside her. "We have to get them to respond. We can't let them fall into the same trap we did." "I'm trying," she snapped, her voice strained. "I'm trying to boost the signal. Just give me a second." Keanu clenched his jaw, frustration mounting as he watched Sarah work. The seconds felt like minutes, and the minutes felt like hours. Every moment they wasted was another moment the entity had to spread its influence. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a clear voice came through the static. "This is Flight 42. We hear you. Who is this?" Keanu breathed a sigh of relief, though it was short-lived. The voice on the other end sounded terrified, disoriented. The crew was in crisis mode, and with good reason. "This is Keanu Reeves," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "I'm on a flight headed in your direction. I'm warning you. You're being attacked. There's something on your plane, something you don't understand." There was a long pause on the other end, followed by a shaky response. "We don't know what's happening. The passengers are getting violent. There's been a breach in the cabin. Something's wrong." Keanu's heart raced. He had no doubt that whatever was happening on their plane was happening there too. The entity was manipulating the passengers, just as it had done with the crew on his own flight. "You need to stay calm," Keanu said, his voice firm. "We can help, but you have to trust us. You have to isolate the control systems, cut off all communications except for this frequency, and make sure no one can reach the cockpit. You're dealing with something otherworldly." The voice on the other end hesitated again. Then came the sound of muffled voices and chaos in the background. Keanu could hear shouting, the unmistakable sound of panic. It sounded like the crew was losing control. "I don't know if we can do that," the voice replied. "It's already in the systems. The lights are flickering. The controls are malfunctioning. Listen to me," Keanu shouted, his tone sharp, desperate. "You need to isolate the plane systems. This thing can take control of the entire aircraft. We've seen it happen. If you don't act fast, you'll lose everyone. You have to act now." There was another long silence, and for a moment, Keanu thought the connection had failed. But then the voice came back, quieter this time, more subdued. "We're going to try," the voice said, "but we don't know if we can hold it off for much longer." Keanu felt a pang of helplessness. It was like déjà vu. He'd been in their shoes just hours ago. The fear, the uncertainty, the feeling of being completely powerless in the face of something larger than life. "Do what you can," Keanu said, his voice steady despite the rising panic in his chest. "We're coming for you. Just hold on." The line went dead. Keanu stood in silence, his hand gripping the back of the seat as the weight of what they were facing sank in. "Do you think they'll make it?" Sarah asked quietly, her voice uncertain. Keanu turned to her, his eyes dark with the weight of everything that had happened. "I don't know, but we can't just sit here and hope. We need to get to them. If they're not able to fight it off, we're their last chance." Sarah nodded, her face a mixture of fear and determination. "Then let's go. We can't waste any more time." Keanu didn't say anything, but he moved quickly, already making adjustments to the plane's course. They were still hours away from the other flight, but they didn't have a choice. They had to act. "Keanu," Sarah said as she followed him, her voice almost a whisper, "what if we can't stop it? What if it's too powerful? What if we're not strong enough?" Keanu stopped and turned to her, his eyes locking onto hers. "Then we fight. We fight until we can't anymore. We owe it to them. We owe it to everyone on that plane." The words hung in the air for a long moment, but neither of them spoke again. They both knew that the battle wasn't over. The entity was still out there, and it was more dangerous than ever. But for the first time in hours, there was a glimmer of hope. They were not alone. There were others out there fighting too. And together, maybe, just maybe, they could stop it. But deep down, Keanu knew the truth. The entity had only just begun to show its true power, and whatever came next would be their hardest battle yet. The hours stretched on like an eternity. Keanu and Sarah sat in tense silence, their eyes fixed on the flight path and the coordinates they were approaching. Every few minutes, Keanu would glance over to Sarah, her face etched with worry as she monitored the systems. It felt as though the weight of the world had settled in the cockpit, a sense of dread hanging in the air, thick and suffocating. Outside, the sky had darkened once again, clouds swirling in unnatural patterns. The plane hummed steadily along its path, but every passing second felt like a countdown, one that none of them could escape. The entity was out there, and it was drawing closer. "Keanu," Sarah's voice broke through the thick tension, her hand hovering over the controls. "I'm picking up more disturbances on the radar. It's almost like something is trying to push us off course." Keanu's stomach tightened. He knew exactly what it was. The entity's power was growing stronger, and it wasn't content with just one plane anymore. It was spreading, reaching out, trying to pull everything it touched into its dark grip. "Can you counteract it?" Keanu asked, his voice low and urgent. Sarah shook her head. "I don't know. The systems are acting strange. Every time I try to make a correction, it feels like something is forcing us back off course. It's like we're being guided by something." "Guided," Keanu muttered under his breath, eyes narrowing. He knew that wasn't a good sign. If the entity was able to manipulate the flight path directly, they were no longer just dealing with an onboard threat. This thing had the ability to control not just the passengers, but the very systems of the aircraft itself. "We have to stay on course," Keanu said firmly, taking a seat beside Sarah. "We're close. I can feel it." Sarah nodded, but Keanu could see the concern in her eyes. She wasn't convinced. Neither of them were. The closer they got to Flight 42, the more the turbulence in the air seemed to increase, like the storm clouds outside were feeding off the presence of the entity. Keanu had been in storms before, real storms, but this was different. This was unnatural. Are you sure this is the right decision? Sarah asked, her voice trembling just slightly as she spoke, a reflection of the fear both of them were trying to suppress. What if we can't help them? What if we can't stop now? Keanu interrupted, his voice hardening with determination. If we don't try, they'll all be lost. The thought was almost too much to bear. The thought that they might arrive and find the other flight already under the entity's control, lost to it like so many others. The idea of losing more lives, knowing they could have done something to prevent it, was an unbearable weight pressing on his chest. I don't know if I can handle this much longer, Keanu, Sarah whispered, her fingers shaking slightly as she adjusted the controls. I feel like we're playing a losing game. Keanu reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder, grounding her with a steady touch. We're not losing, Sarah. We're surviving. And as long as we're fighting, there's a chance we can win. A slight nod was the only response she gave. Her eyes were locked on the horizon, but Keanu knew her mind was far from the clear skies ahead. They were both holding on by a thread. And then, as if on cue, the radio crackled again, a sudden burst of static flooding the cockpit. It was a signal from Flight 42. Keanu. The voice was shaky, desperate. We've lost control. It's too much. The passengers, the crew, they've all turned. Something is inside them. It's everywhere. They're everywhere. Help us. Please. Keanu's heart pounded in his chest as he heard the desperation in the other crew's voice. It was happening, just like they feared. The entity had taken hold. The darkness was consuming them, one by one. Hold on, Keanu said, his voice cold with resolve. We're coming. Just hang on. We're going to help you. The connection cut off abruptly, leaving only the buzzing static in the air. Keanu stared at the radio panel for a moment, unable to shake the feeling that they were racing against something that couldn't be beaten. The entity was too powerful, too insidious. It wasn't just attacking. It was taking control, piece by piece. Keanu, what do we do now? Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing thoughts. They had no plan, no clear path forward. The entity had already shown its ability to manipulate the systems, to control the very fabric of their reality. What could they possibly do to stop it? We find a way in, he said, his voice filled with a grim determination. We can't stop it if we don't get to the source. We need to get to the cockpit of Flight 42, confront whatever's there, and take back control. We have no other choice. Sarah's eyes widened with fear. You want us to land on that plane? In the middle of whatever's happening? Are you out of your mind? Keanu's gaze never wavered. If we don't, it won't just be them. It'll be everyone. The entity will keep spreading, until it's not just one flight or two. It will swallow the entire sky. Sarah didn't respond immediately. She kept adjusting the controls, her face tense as she typed commands into the system, but Keanu could see the fear in her eyes. She knew, just as he did, that they were entering a battlefield where the rules didn't apply, where every assumption they had about what was possible was being tested to its breaking point. As they descended through the dark clouds, the radio crackled to life once again, cutting through the suffocating silence. Keanu, can you hear me? The voice was faint but urgent. It was coming from the other plane. We've lost the ability to control the aircraft. The passengers, they're not themselves anymore. It's like they're all connected. Keanu's heart dropped. This wasn't just an attack on the crew. It was an infection, a full-scale takeover. The entity wasn't just controlling minds. It was controlling everything. And they were running out of time. Listen to me, Keanu said, his voice firm as he grabbed the microphone. You need to isolate the cockpit. Do not let anyone in. If the passengers have been compromised, they could be part of the entity's plan. We can't let it spread further. There was a brief silence, followed by a panicked voice. We're trying, Keanu. But they're breaking in. They're coming for us. We need help now. The connection cut out abruptly, leaving nothing but the cold, ominous hum of static. Keanu felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The flight crew on that plane was losing control. They were in the same position he and Sarah had been in not too long ago. Trapped, powerless, and slowly succumbing to something they didn't understand. "We have to hurry," Sarah said, glancing at him with wide eyes. "We can't let them fall too." Keanu nodded. "We're close. Just a little longer." But the closer they got, the more the turbulence intensified. The plane shook violently, throwing them off course with each passing moment. The systems beeped erratically, flickering as though the very plane itself was trying to resist their journey. Keanu grabbed the controls, holding the yoke steady as the plane banked hard to the left. "Sarah, can you fix this? We're losing everything." "I'm trying." Sarah's voice was cut off by a sudden jolt, and she slammed her fist against the console in frustration. "The systems are corrupt. They're not responding." The wind howled outside the cockpit, whipping past the windows with a deafening roar. The plane lurched again, this time more violently. Keanu could feel his heart racing, his pulse pounding in his ears. It was like the sky itself was fighting them, trying to keep them from reaching their destination. Sarah fell silent, the gravity of his words settling in. She knew he was right. There was no way around it. The stakes had grown too high. They had to act, and they had to act now. "All right," she said after a long pause, her voice steely with resolve. "I'll adjust the flight path, but we need to be ready. Whatever we're walking into, it won't be pretty." Keanu nodded, his mind already running through possible scenarios, each darker than the last. But he couldn't afford to second-guess himself. Not now. Not when lives were on the line. As the plane soared through the skies, heading toward the other aircraft, Keanu's thoughts drifted back to what the entity had said before it had disappeared. "They're everywhere." The entity was not just one thing. It was a force, a dark, malevolent presence that had the power to spread, to infiltrate every corner of existence. It wasn't just a single plane. It was everywhere. And the only way to stop it was to cut it off at the source. Whatever that source was. Keanu felt a chill run down his spine as the realization hit him. They weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for everything. The plane's engines hummed steadily beneath them, but the air felt charged with something unspoken. An electric tension, a heaviness that weighed down on Keanu's chest. His hands gripped the armrests, knuckles white as the cockpit screens flickered once again, each blip of malfunction confirming his worst fears. It wasn't just their plane that was compromised. It was everything. "This is it," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're about to enter their airspace. If we don't act fast, we'll be caught in the same web." Keanu nodded, eyes narrowed as he looked out the window, where the storm clouds continued to gather like an ominous omen. He couldn't shake the feeling that the dark entity wasn't just inside the other plane. It had already found its way into the very skies. The more they drew closer, the more he felt it, a presence watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. "Keanu," Sarah said, her fingers flying across the console in front of her, trying to stabilize the systems once again. "We're losing altitude. If we don't regain control, we won't make it in one piece." "Keep trying," Keanu said, his voice steady. "We need to stay airborne. Don't let it win." But as he looked at the instrument panel, he realized they weren't just fighting against the entity, they were fighting against time itself. Every second that ticked by felt like a countdown to something much worse than either of them could have anticipated. "We need to get to the cockpit of Flight 42, Keanu said, his voice sharp as he glanced over at Sarah, "before it gets any worse." The plane's engines hummed with a strange urgency as it descended, its wings slicing through the air, fighting against the chaos of the storm. Keanu's eyes were locked on Flight 42, now clearly visible through the turbulent clouds. It was drifting ominously, almost lifeless in the sky. The flicker of the emergency lights on the other aircraft made it look like a ghost ship, stranded in the void. "That's it," Sarah said, her voice tight. She was staring at the distant plane, her hands shaking slightly as she worked the controls. "That's the one. We're almost there." Keanu's mind raced, his thoughts a blur. The entity was inside that plane, manipulating everyone, twisting reality, and he had no idea what he would face when they landed. He had prepared for the physical fight, but the terror of the unknown loomed larger with every passing second. Would they find the crew and passengers completely lost, consumed by whatever dark force had taken over them? Or would they discover something worse, something more horrifying than they could ever imagine? Prepare for the worst, Keanu muttered, though he was certain Sarah was already preparing herself mentally. They both knew that what they were about to face would change everything. With a sharp intake of breath, Sarah made the final adjustments to the plane's descent. The engines whined in protest as they dropped lower, navigating through the storm that seemed to pulse around them. The turbulence didn't relent. It felt as though the very atmosphere itself was pushing against them, trying to prevent them from reaching their destination. Keanu's grip tightened on the controls, his knuckles white. Outside, the wind howled in a deafening crescendo, but amidst the cacophony, Keanu could hear something else. A sound so faint it was almost imperceptible, like a low hum vibrating through the air. It wasn't the storm, nor the plane. No, this sound was something else, something more sinister. A whisper. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a voice that didn't belong. "Sarah," Keanu said urgently, his voice cracking with rising tension. "Do you hear that?" Sarah's head snapped toward him, her eyes wide with alarm. She nodded, her lips pale. It's coming from the other plane. I hear it too." The whisper grew louder, more distinct, like a low, guttural chant. It was a sound that filled the cockpit with a sense of creeping dread, a sound that seemed to claw at Keanu's mind, pulling at the edges of his sanity. "The entity," he whispered, fear creeping into his voice. "It's trying to get to us. It's calling us." "I've got it," Sarah shouted, her voice almost breaking through the chaos. "I've restored enough power to keep us stable for now, but we need to land. Now." Keanu glanced at her, his brow furrowed with confusion. "Land? In this storm? Are you out of your mind?" "There's no choice," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "We can't keep flying. Not like this. The longer we're up here, the more we're exposed to whatever this thing is. We land, we regroup, and then we get to Flight 42. Keanu hesitated, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. The storm was unlike anything he'd seen before, swirling with an unnatural ferocity. Landing now seemed almost suicidal, but he couldn't afford to second-guess himself. They were running out of options. "All right," he said, his voice low but firm. "Prepare for an emergency landing. Stay focused, Sarah. We're not giving up." With a quick nod, Sarah began to dial in the emergency landing protocol, her fingers flying over the buttons as the storm outside grew more violent. The roar of the wind was deafening now, and Keanu could feel the pull of the turbulence in every bone of his body. The plane felt like it was fighting against the very air around it, struggling to stay in control. As they descended further, the cockpit lights flickered once again. The shadows inside seemed to stretch and twist, as though something dark was creeping in at the edges. Keanu's mind raced, and a gut-wrenching sense of dread crawled up his spine. "We're not alone, are we?" he muttered under his breath. Sarah's eyes met his, wide with fear. "No, we're not." The turbulence hit them hard, and for a moment, Keanu thought they were going to lose control completely. The plane pitched and rolled, its engines roaring in protest as it struggled to stay aloft. Keanu fought the controls, his muscles straining as he fought against the wind and the dark force that seemed to be taking hold. Then, without warning, the storm broke, and for a split second, there was silence. The plane was still, suspended in the air, hovering on the edge of something much darker. Keanu's breath caught in his throat as he looked out the window, catching sight of the other aircraft in the distance, silhouetted against the backdrop of the darkened sky. "Flight 42, he whispered. "We're here." But as he said the words, something shifted, something terrible. The plane jolted again, and the turbulence returned with a vengeance. The storm wasn't over. It had only just begun. The plane came to a halt. Silence. For a brief, fleeting moment, there was only the hum of the engines winding down and the ragged breathing of both Keanu and Sarah. Keanu exhaled slowly, his hands trembling on the controls. He looked over at Sarah, who was staring ahead, her face ashen. "We're here," Keanu said quietly. We made it. But even as he spoke, he knew that the battle was far from over. The storm wasn't just outside. It had already begun to seep inside, into the very bones of the plane. There was something moving within the shadows. The entity was waiting for them. Keanu looked out the window, his eyes narrowing as he saw the twisted forms on Flight 42 moving closer. It wasn't over yet. This was only the beginning. The moment Keanu and Sarah stepped off their plane, the air felt different, thick, heavy, as though it had been polluted by something dark and insidious. The storm raged on above them, but it was no longer the storm that commanded their attention. It was what lay ahead. Keanu could feel the weight of the silence pressing against him, suffocating. The usual sounds of the airport were gone. The usual hum of activity, the bustle of announcements, the laughter of passengers waiting for their bags. Here, there was only stillness. A quiet that felt wrong, unnatural. Flight 42 loomed ahead, its emergency lights flickering, casting eerie, pale shadows across the tarmac. The plane stood like a silent sentinel, waiting for them to approach. Keanu's instinct screamed at him to turn back, to get back on their plane and escape this place before it was too late. But they didn't have that luxury. "We have to go in," Sarah said, her voice tight with determination, though it was clear she was just as unnerved as Keanu. She was already moving toward the entrance to the plane, her steps slow but resolute. Keanu followed, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, none of them comforting. As they approached the door, Sarah reached for the handle, but it wasn't locked. That in itself was a strange feeling, an eerie invitation into the unknown. She hesitated for just a second, glancing back at Keanu, as though silently asking if they were truly ready for what awaited them inside. Sarah's eyes darted back to the radar. "I'm losing control," she muttered under her breath. "We're too close now. I can't stabilize it." Keanu looked over at her, his pulse pounding in his throat. The warning signs were all there. This wasn't just about stopping the entity anymore. This was about surviving it. "We don't have time to fight the system," Keanu said, his voice firm. "We need to land. Now." With a final push, the plane made its way through the last layer of clouds, and the full scale of the terror they were about to face became painfully clear. Flight 42 was now only a few hundred yards away, and the eerie glow of its emergency lights cast an unnatural hue over the cockpit. It was like they were heading straight into the mouth of a beast, dark and waiting. The radio crackled, and the voice came through again, now filled with palpable fear. "Keanu, help us, please. We can't." The transmission cut off suddenly, leaving a static-filled silence. Keanu's heart raced, and for a moment, he feared they had already lost the crew of Flight 42. But then, the plane lurched again, and the storm intensified, as if pushing them closer to the danger they were rushing toward. "We're going in," Keanu said, his voice grim. "Hold on tight." Sarah nodded, her fingers dancing over the console, desperately trying to stabilize the flight path. But the storm had a different plan. The winds pushed them off course again, and the sky seemed to twist, as if the very fabric of reality was bending around them. Keanu gritted his teeth and steeled himself for what was to come. As the gap between the two planes closed, he could see the figures moving in the windows of Flight 42. They were not normal. They were distorted. Shadows that shouldn't have been moving the way they were. And then, there was a scream. A blood-curdling scream that cut through the chaos like a knife. Keanu's heart stopped. He didn't hesitate. "We're landing now," he yelled, his voice cutting through the cacophony of noise in the cockpit. "Sarah, get us down." Sarah, barely holding it together, executed the landing maneuver. The earth seemed to rush up at them, and Keanu's stomach dropped as he braced for impact. The roar of the wind was deafening, but it was nothing compared to the hellish sound that emanated from Flight 42 as it neared the ground. As the wheels touched down, the plane shuddered violently. Keanu's teeth ground together as they fought to maintain control. The aircraft finally slammed into the tarmac, skidding to a stop with a jarring screech that sent a shockwave through his body. He gave her a grim nod. "We don't have a choice." Together, they stepped inside. The atmosphere in the cabin was stifling, as though the air itself had been drained of all life. The usual hum of the plane's interior, the quiet whispers of passengers and crew, were replaced by a heavy silence. The lights flickered, casting strange, elongated shadows across the empty seats. But it wasn't the emptiness that struck them most. It was the smell. A sharp, metallic scent mixed with something sour and decaying. It was the smell of something gone wrong, something that had been left to fester for far too long. Keanu felt a chill run down his spine. "Where is everyone?" he muttered, his voice low, though it felt absurd to ask. He already knew the answer. Sarah moved carefully down the aisle, her eyes darting from one empty seat to the next. "They're here," she said quietly. "They're just not themselves anymore." A figure emerged from the shadows ahead of them, one of the flight attendants. But the sight of her stopped Keanu in his tracks. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking, her movements jerky and unnatural. It was as though she wasn't quite in control of her own body. The woman's mouth parted, but the words that came out were not hers. "You shouldn't have come," she hissed, her voice deep and distorted, like something being pulled through a crackling speaker. "The darkness is already inside you." Keanu's blood ran cold. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond. His thoughts raced. He needed a plan. They had to get control of this situation before it spread any further. He reached for the knife at his belt, his only weapon, but the woman didn't seem to notice. "We're not afraid of you," Sarah said, stepping forward, her voice unwavering even as her body trembled slightly. "You're not the only one who's been through hell." The woman's head tilted at an unnatural angle, and she let out a laugh that sounded more like a cough, something sickening in the way it rattled her chest. "You think you can stop it?" she croaked. "You think you can stop what's already been unleashed?" The temperature in the cabin dropped suddenly, and Keanu could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The air had turned thick, heavier somehow, and the sound of a low hum began to pulse through the walls, vibrating in his bones. It was like the plane itself was alive, or worse, sick. The entity was making its presence felt, and Keanu had no doubt it was aware of their every move. Without warning, the woman lunged at them, her hands reaching out with inhuman speed, fingers clawing towards Sarah's throat. Keanu reacted instantly, shoving Sarah out of the way and grabbing the woman's wrist in a tight hold. She screamed, but the sound wasn't human. It was something guttural, a noise that seemed to echo from the deepest part of her soul. He swung his elbow into her face, and for a moment, there was a crack, a sharp, sickening crack. The woman collapsed to the floor, her body twitching uncontrollably. But even as she fell, the dark energy around her swelled, spreading through the air like poison, infecting the very space around them. Keanu backed away, pulling Sarah with him. "We need to move. Now." They ran down the aisle, their footsteps echoing in the hollow silence, as they searched for the cockpit. Every corner they turned, every seat they passed, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It wasn't just the passengers anymore. It was the plane itself, or whatever entity had taken control of it. As they reached the cockpit door, Keanu shoved it open with force. The inside was dark, the instruments flickering, but there were no signs of the flight crew. They were gone, vanished, just like the others. But Keanu could feel it. The entity was here, lurking, waiting to strike. Suddenly, a flash of light burst from the back of the cabin, illuminating the darkened space. Keanu spun around, his heart hammering in his chest. A figure stood at the far end of the aisle, bathed in an eerie, otherworldly glow. It wasn't human, not anymore. Its eyes were black voids, endless and consuming, and its body seemed to stretch and shift in unnatural ways, like it was made of shadows. Its face twisted into something monstrous, a grotesque mockery of a human form. The entity. "Keanu," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "What do we do now?" Keanu's breath hitched. He knew what needed to be done, but it wasn't going to be easy. They had no weapons, no backup. The only thing they had was each other and the will to fight. "We do what we have to," Keanu said, his voice steady, though the uncertainty clawed at him. "We survive." The entity stepped forward, the air around it warping, distorting as it advanced. Keanu could feel it then, the pull of its influence, the way it tried to crawl inside his mind. But he was ready. He had to be. "We're not alone," Keanu muttered. "We're in this together." He clenched his fists and took a step forward, prepared to face whatever horrors lay ahead. The entity's shadow stretched across the plain, warping the air around it as if reality itself was bending in submission to its will. Keanu's pulse pounded in his ears, but he forced himself to stay calm. The battle for survival was no longer just about escaping the plane. It was about fighting back against an unseen force that had been manipulating everything, from the storm to the twisted passengers. Keanu's eyes locked with the entity's, and he could feel its gaze, cold, infinite, and devoid of empathy, piercing into him. The darkness was powerful, and it had already made its mark on the plane. Its influence was palpable, suffocating the air, twisting the very fabric of reality. "We have to fight back," Sarah said through gritted teeth, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She looked as determined as Keanu, but fear still crept into her eyes. This was beyond anything either of them had prepared for. Keanu nodded, his voice low but resolute. "We don't have a choice. We have to destroy it before it gets worse." The entity's form flickered, shifting and pulsating as though it was made of liquid shadows. Its eyes, those empty, void-like sockets, moved from Sarah to Keanu, and it grinned. The grin wasn't a human smile. It was a twisted, grotesque expression that seemed to stretch impossibly wide. "You think you can stop me?" the entity's voice rumbled. It wasn't just coming from its mouth. It echoed inside their heads, reverberating in their skulls, as if it had claimed dominion over their very thoughts. "I've been here longer than you can imagine. I have seen worlds crumble, and I have seen hope die." Sarah flinched at the words, but Keanu stood his ground. "You don't own us. You never will." The entity's laugh was a low, terrifying sound that seemed to vibrate the walls of the plane. Such defiance is always amusing, but it is futile. Before Keanu could react, the shadows surged toward him, tendrils of darkness whipping through the air like living things, wrapping around his arms and legs. He gritted his teeth and tried to break free, but the shadows tightened, pulling him toward the entity. "Keanu!" Sarah screamed. She rushed toward him, but the darkness wasn't done yet. The tendrils shot out, ensnaring Sarah in their grasp. She screamed, her body struggling against the weight of the force pulling her down. "Sarah!" Keanu's voice cracked as he fought harder against the inky tendrils. They seemed to be everywhere now, each one coming from the entity itself. It was feeding off their fear, feeding off their desperation. But he couldn't give in, not now. In a burst of adrenaline, Keanu broke free from the shadows that had bound him. He lunged toward Sarah, reaching out just as the tendrils began to drag her into the darkness. "Hold on to me," Keanu yelled, grabbing her wrist with one hand while using his other to pry the darkness away from her. It was like fighting against a storm, and the more they struggled, the tighter the tendrils seemed to become. But then, as if sensing the change in their determination, the entity paused. Its expression, if it could be called that, shifted. The darkness in the air swirled, and for a moment, it seemed almost uncertain, as if the force that had consumed so much of the plane wasn't entirely invincible. Keanu's breath was shallow, his grip on Sarah's wrist firm. "We need something that will break its hold," he said, his mind racing for anything they could use. The shadows that wrapped around them were growing stronger by the second, but his will remained unbroken. Then it hit him. The knife. The blade strapped to his side. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. With a sharp motion, Keanu drew it, and without hesitation, he slashed at the nearest tendril, the blade cutting through the darkness with an unexpected force. The shadow recoiled, but only for a moment before it reformed, its body pulsing with an even greater intensity. "Do it again," Sarah shouted, her voice desperate. Keanu's arm trembled from the effort, but he didn't stop. He swung the knife again, slashing through the tendrils with all his strength, watching as the darkness seemed to recoil and dissipate slightly. Each strike seemed to weaken the entity's hold on the plane, but not enough to defeat it entirely. Then, In a moment of realization, Keanu saw the faintest glimmer of light above them. An emergency exit hatch. It wasn't much, but it was a way out. He could feel it, the pull of hope that had always been there, flickering just at the edge of despair. "Sarah!" Keanu shouted, his eyes locking onto the hatch. "We need to get to that hatch now." The entity's form shifted again, this time more violently, as though it was enraged by their defiance. It screeched, a sound that reverberated through their bones. But the air had changed. The plane itself seemed to fight back, the walls trembling, the lights flickering as though it too was trying to expel the darkness. Keanu grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her toward the hatch. The tendrils lashed out one last time, but they were weaker now, not nearly as fast. Sarah's strength seemed to be returning as well. Together, they managed to make it to the hatch, and with a forceful shove, Keanu wrenched it open. The moment they stepped through, the world shifted. The plane seemed to groan in agony, its very foundation shaking, but the darkness did not follow them. They had escaped, for the moment, but the battle wasn't over. Not by a long shot. They found themselves on the wing of the plane, the wind howling around them. The storm still raged, but it was different now, no longer a force controlled by the entity. It was just a storm, wild, chaotic, but no longer under the entity's influence. Keanu and Sarah stood side by side, breathless and battered. They knew the real fight was still ahead of them. The entity was not gone. It was only waiting for the right moment to strike again. But this time, they were ready. "We'll finish this," Keanu said, his voice low but unwavering. "We're not letting it win." Sarah nodded, her eyes steely with resolve. Together, the winds howled louder, but now, it felt more like the storm was an ally they would use to finish what had begun. The storm raged on, wild and untamed, as Keanu and Sarah stood on the wing of the plane, the wind whipping at their faces and the rain stinging their skin. The darkness inside Flight 42 had been pushed back, but the battle was far from over. They could feel it, like an oppressive weight on their shoulders. The entity was still out there, still watching, still waiting. Keanu turned to Sarah, his expression grim. "We need to finish this. We can't let it follow us." Sarah nodded, her eyes narrowed in determination. The fight was personal now. They had already lost so much, but they were not going to lose again. Not to this thing. "Where do we even begin?" Sarah asked, her voice raw with exhaustion but still holding the sharp edge of determination. "It's not just a creature. It's something else. It's everywhere. Inside the plane. In the storm. In us." Keanu looked back at the swirling clouds above them, the sky black and tumultuous. But amidst the storm, something caught his eye. The faint glow of the emergency lights on Flight 42. It was as though the plane was still alive, still pulsing with the remnants of the entity's dark power. "We take the fight to it," Keanu said, his voice resolute. "We go back. We end this." Sarah didn't hesitate. She turned and followed him as they carefully made their way along the wing, the wind howling louder, the storm surging violently around them. But nothing could drown out the pull they both felt, the undeniable call to finish what they had started. As they reached the rear emergency exit of Flight 42, they hesitated only for a moment. Keanu pushed open the door, his breath steady as he peered inside. The cabin was eerily still, the silence oppressive. The entity was here, but where? Without warning, the temperature dropped. A cold, biting chill filled the air, and the faint hum of the entity's influence returned, like the murmur of a distant storm. Only this time, it was closer. Keanu could feel it in his bones. The darkness was alive, twisting and curling through the very walls of the plane, crawling towards them like a hungry predator. "Stay close," Keanu whispered to Sarah, his voice low and controlled, though his heart raced. The moment they stepped back into the plane, they would be in its territory. The final battle would begin. They moved cautiously down the darkened aisle, each step echoing in the silence. The emergency lights flickered sporadically, casting grotesque shadows on the walls, distorting the interior of the plane. Everything felt wrong. Everything felt twisted. Suddenly, a soft noise, a scraping sound, broke the silence. Keanu's eyes snapped to the side. From the shadows emerged the figure of the flight attendant they had seen earlier. But now, she was no longer just a puppet of the entity. She was something more. Her face was blank, eyes empty, and her body moved with an unnatural fluidity, as if she were no longer fully human. But it wasn't just her. All around them, the other passengers were emerging, walking slowly down the aisles, their faces vacant, their movements jerky and mechanical. It wasn't just a plane full of passengers anymore. It was a breeding ground for the entity, a nest where it had laid its claim, turning everyone into its puppet. Keanu could feel the anger rising within him, the urge to stop it, to save what was left of the people trapped inside. But as they advanced, the figure of the flight attendant spoke again, her voice distorted, as if someone, or something, else was speaking through her. "You think you can save them?" she hissed, her head tilting at an unnatural angle. "You cannot save them. You cannot save yourselves." Keanu's grip tightened on the knife in his hand, his heart pounding. "We'll see about that." And then, with a sickening screech, the entity revealed itself in its true form. It was no longer just a presence, no longer just an intangible force that lingered in the shadows. It was a being, a dark, shapeless mass, swirling with shadows and darkness. Its form shifted constantly, as if it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. The faces of the passengers flashed within the dark mass, their expressions twisted in agony. "You should have never come here," the entity growled, its voice seeping into their minds, wrapping around their thoughts like a choking vine. "You think you're the first to try? I've consumed worlds. I've consumed countless souls." Keanu swallowed hard, trying to push back the growing fear that threatened to overtake him. But he refused to let it. He wasn't going to let the entity win. Not now, not after everything they had been through. "We're not afraid of you," he said, his voice steady. The entity laughed, a terrible, echoing sound that shook the very foundations of the plane. It stretched forward, tendrils of darkness shooting toward Keanu and Sarah. But Keanu was ready. He swung the knife, slashing at the tendrils as they lunged toward him. Each strike caused the shadows to recoil, but it wasn't enough. The entity wasn't just physical. It was in their minds, in their hearts. It was everything. "We have to destroy its source," Keanu said, gasping for air as he fought to hold the darkness at bay. "It's inside the plane. It's inside us. We need to get to the core." But the entity was relentless. Its tendrils grew stronger, faster, coiling around them, squeezing tighter. Keanu could feel it, the pressure building in his chest, his head, his heart. It was trying to break him. Then, in a burst of desperation, Sarah reached for something, a small, glowing object she had pulled from her pocket earlier. It was a piece of technology, something they had found on the plane during their search. The object hummed with energy, a strange, pulsing light. "Keanu, this is it," Sarah shouted, holding it up. "This is the source. It's the only thing that can stop it." Keanu's heart skipped a beat. "Use it. Now." Sarah slammed the device onto the floor, and in that instant, a brilliant light exploded from the device, flooding the entire plane. The darkness screamed, its form writhing as the light engulfed it, tearing at the shadows. Keanu and Sarah shielded their eyes from the blinding brilliance. But through the light, they saw the entity begin to shrink, its form collapsing inward, unraveling. The screams of the passengers, twisted and tortured, faded into silence. It was over. The plane shook violently, and for a moment, Keanu feared it would tear apart. But then, just as suddenly, the shaking stopped. The storm outside began to dissipate, and the oppressive weight of the darkness lifted from the air. The entity was gone. Keanu breathed a sigh of relief, his chest heavy with exhaustion. The battle was over. They had won. But as he looked at Sarah, his eyes meeting hers, he knew that the fight had changed them. The darkness they had faced would never fully leave them. But they had survived. Together. "We did it," Sarah said, her voice shaky but triumphant. "It's over." Keanu nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Yeah, it's over." But even as they stood there, bathed in the light of victory, They both knew one thing for sure. Darkness could never be fully defeated. It would always be waiting, lurking in the corners of the world. And when it returned, they would be ready. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?